A majestic white-tailed deer was hung up by a man. He cut some meat from the deer and roasted it on a stick. The tender roasted meat was captivating. This free-spirited life unfolded in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Before dawn, Eustace got up early. Autumn hunting is an annual important ritual. All his food came from nature, including fresh meat. Today, his target was a deer, and the first light was usually the best time to spot one. He sat down with his back against a large tree, a good spot with a clear view, ideal for waiting. As time passed, Eustace had been sitting for hours, but unfortunately, he hadn't seen any deer. He then made an important decision to move to another area. Due to the deer's high alertness, he had to move slowly and use the big trees for cover, being cautious with every step. Hunting is a test of patience. Soon, he noticed signs of a deer's activity, the way a buck marks its territory. Eustace hid behind a large tree, waiting for the buck to appear. Before long, a deer came into view. Eustace watched its every move and prepared his gun. When the deer moved into an open area, he decisively shot. The buck tried to flee but staggered from the gunshot. For humanitarian reasons, Eustace fired another shot. The buck fell instantly. After waiting a while and seeing no movement, Eustace slowly approached. Instead of seeing the deer at first, he found blood trails. Following these, he found the buck already on the ground. Holding the antlers, he admired them closely. The deer was too beautiful. Eustace thanked it for its sacrifice. Back home, he hung the deer up and began to cut along the neck to skin it. Soon he had completely skinned the deer and draped the hide over a nearby wooden bench. Then he began to butcher the deer, placing the parts on the deerskin. He cut tenderloin from the deer, preparing it for dinner. Eustace roasted a piece of meat over the fire. Once cooked, he savored it with squinted eyes, enjoying the familiar taste that always felt heavenly. This was the simple and blissful rural life. The shredder is spinning wildly. A bearded man grimly stuffs small objects into the machine. The output is a mess of bloody flesh, which are actually little mice, used as fishing bait to be sent across the country. This takes place in Montana's Salish Mountains. Hunter Paul moved here 6 years ago and began his mountain life. He rents this homestead with the goal of saving to buy the land. To gather the down payment, he works very hard. Today, a distinguished guest visits his home. Old Hunter Tom, a wise sage of the region with vast hunting and leather tanning experience, is also a helpful elder. He brought a pine marten trap to teach the young man. Paul is thrilled with this valuable trapping technique. They head to the eastern woods to find a spot for the trap. Pine martens, popular for their soft fur, come from the far north. Quickly, Tom selects a sloping tree, hangs a trapping box on it, places beaver meat at the bottom, and sets a trap at the entrance. Paul started hunting at age 10 and became passionate about it. He dedicates his life to the mountains. Now, at a crucial moment, Tom lights a piece of deerskin with a lighter. The scent of the burnt fur travels far, attracting the pine marten. Paul is immensely impressed. After bidding farewell to Tom, Paul returns to his busy work. The trapping season has begun, and he hopes to make a significant profit this year. First, he boils all the traps to remove human scent. He has an old boiler, but needs another as it cannot accommodate all the traps. He cuts a door in the middle of a drum and an octagon at the back, welds 2 drums together, installs a chimney, and completes a boiler for boiling water. The boiling mixture includes some wood dye, which removes rust and human scent. As the fire grows, the mixture boils. Paul places each trap in the boiling water. Excited for the new season, he is one of many living a simple, rich mountain life in Montana's Tobacco Root Mountains. It's late autumn, and Hunter Jake sets out on a hunting trip. With winter approaching, he will protect the ranch from mountain lions and wolves coming down the hills. His goal today is to stockpile food for winter, targeting a white-tailed deer. Last winter, he and his girlfriend Annika made a grand plan. Her family funded their purchase of a piece of land where they built a homestead. They held a wedding there in the summer. To provide for the family, Jake needed to work much harder. In Montana, there are still 7 weeks until the rifle hunting season, and it is currently the archery season. Since there has been a meat shortage at home for half a month, Jake has no choice but to take a risk. The disadvantage of archery is that he must get close to the target. Wounded prey can become aggressive, and their final counterattacks can be deadly. After some searching, Jake finally spotted 2 deer about 1,000 yards away. Due to the deer's high alertness to maintain silence, Jake opted for light gear and used a haystack as cover. He could now clearly see the deer's head, but the distance was still a bit far. However, at this point, Jake had to try hunting. He slowly approached the fence, pulling the bowstring and imitating a sheep's bleat, hoping the deer would stand up. But the deer, either deaf or foolish, just stared blankly at Jake without the wariness typical of prey. As Jake's arms grew sore, the deer finally stood up belatedly. Due to the pain in his arms, Jake missed his shot by a wide margin. Watching the deer flee, Jake could only curse in frustration. He followed them into the woods. Bows are not suited for open areas but excel in small forests. Following tracks on the ground, Jake quickly found an animal trail. By staying here, he was sure to encounter deer. He constructed a hideout from some trees and settled in to wait. As evening approached, several deer appeared. Jake calmly selected his target, and upon noticing a doe that seemed aware of him, they locked eyes. Jake thought, "It's you." He stood, aimed, and decisively released the arrow. It seemed to hit the target, but the deer quickly ran away. Jake moved forward to check and found some blood traces on the ground. He had indeed hit his target. Now, he needed to track the deer. Night would soon fall in the mountains, leaving him little time. As he progressed, he saw more blood traces. The deer might have fallen somewhere, and with night being the time when predators are active, Jake was very worried that his deer could be stolen. Moreover, a river ahead had washed away all traces. Jake tried searching the opposite bank. Perhaps mercifully, after some time, he again saw blood traces, and not far ahead, the deer lay dead, no longer breathing. After a busy day, Jake was tired but had no time to rest. Only by safely bringing the meat home could he consider his task complete. After removing the entrails, he hoisted the deer with difficulty and started his journey back. Although tough, the effort was worth it. For the next 2 months, they wouldn't have to worry about food. Jake had hunted a white-tailed deer, obtaining hundreds of pounds of meat. However, since settling down, his appetite had grown for unknown reasons, and his meat consumption had dramatically increased. So, after many days, he and Annika set out to hunt David's deer. It was Annika's first time participating in a big hunt. She was nervous, yet excited. As a veterinarian, her job was to save animals, but hunting was about ending lives, creating a strange feeling for her. David's deer are 3 times the size of regular deer and often live in remote mountain areas. Tracking them requires patience and luck. First, they built a camp for the night in an open area, cleared the snow, and quickly set up a tent with prepared materials. Then they patrolled the area, trying to spot David's deer. For better observation, they climbed a high slope, took out binoculars, and started scanning from above. Jake, an experienced hunter, soon spotted David's deer and pointed them out to Annika. They didn't act rashly, as David's deer move quickly and are best tracked when settled. After observing for a while, Jake confirmed the deer had stopped and it was time to start the chase. They descended the hill briskly, entering an open area, but stopped because David's deer are very alert, and walking boldly could startle them. They also heard competing coyotes nearby. Following the sounds, they saw an adult coyote. At this point, whether they could approach the deer smoothly was up to fate. But soon, Jake stopped again. From the deer prints on the ground, he deduced the deer had been driven forward by the coyote, and the coyote's hunt was not yet over. Indeed, 5 miles away, the deer moved again. Clearly, it was no longer suitable for hunting, and they returned disheartened. On the road, Jake suddenly pulled Annika down because there was another herd of deer hidden in a dip ahead. They chose to crawl forward, and, once close enough, began preparing to shoot. The deer lay there quietly, but Annika hesitated to fire due to the strong wind shaking her confidence. With Jake's patient guidance, Annika finally pulled the trigger. The gunshot scared the deer away, but one of the David's deer fell, having been hit. They approached to check the target. It was a mature David's deer weighing over 600 pounds, enough to provide meat for at least 3 months. They quickly butchered the deer with sharp knives, packing the main parts categorically. Soon they completed the task and headed back to camp with backpacks full of deer meat. As night fell, a bright fire lit up. After a busy day, both were famished. Jake started preparing dinner using the fresh tender loin, the best part of the meat. He sliced it and grilled it over the fire, soon filling the air with a delicious aroma. Annika picked up a piece, blew on it, and put it in her mouth. The hot meat nearly burned her tongue, but the flavor instantly won her over, and she chewed eagerly. Jake also expressed great satisfaction. Such delicacies are rare in this world. They enjoyed their meal while chatting and laughing, with Annika very pleased with this married life, thinking marrying Jake was the right choice. In Washington, wolves were nearly extinct until their numbers began to rebound after 2008. Today, they are active in every corner of the mountains. If a pack of wolves is hunting David's deer, the herd keeps moving, which is bad news for Hunter Ray. Today, however, he is in luck. After a brief stare down with a David's deer, Ray quickly raised his rifle as the deer prepared to leave. Because bushes blocked his view and he didn't want to startle the deer, he lowered his rifle. He didn't give up and continued to follow the deer as the snow fell heavily. Fortunately, he caught up with the herd and aimed his rifle just as a David's deer looked his way. Ray fired decisively. When he reached the spot where the deer had stood, only some fur was left in the snow. Following the tracks, Ray finally found the deer lying down the slope. Breathing heavily, he felt a surge of excitement. He patted the David's deer, hoping it would understand, then quickly sliced open its belly with a sharp knife, removed the hot heart to cool in the snow, and left the rest of the organs to nature. He then butchered the deer, packed the meat by type, and wrapped the head in its hide. Now he had to move the meat to a safe location. By nightfall, Ray had finished processing everything. He built a fire and grilled the deer heart for dinner. After a long day, he was very hungry. He grabbed the deer heart and bit into it, thoroughly enjoying the taste. Meanwhile, in the far north at Iliamna Lake, it was late autumn. Aaron was making final preparations for the coming winter. Yesterday, he transported 700 pounds of supplies from the town to his current location, but his destination was still 20 miles away. This part of the journey was the most challenging, filled with swamps and steep hills. Aaron set off, racing against time, because once heavy snow falls, the roads will close completely. The fishing cabin by Iliamna Lake, where he and his wife have lived for 6 years, will be isolated from the world until spring. Despite the many times he has traveled this road, it still gives him a headache. The rugged mountain road constantly shakes the vehicle, and fallen trees frequently block the path. Luckily, he carries a chainsaw in the vehicle to clear the way. Meanwhile, at their 5-acre fishing cabin, Jenny was tending to the livestock. The yard housed many chickens, and their eggs were an important part of their diet. To prevent the chickens from freezing in winter, she added wood shavings to the coop for insulation. Additionally, they kept several hunting dogs that helped with hunting and guarded the home. Jenny had once been a search and rescue medic, but the competitive pressure of city life was too overwhelming. This led the couple to choose a rural lifestyle. Despite being busy, they found each day fulfilling. Back to Aaron, he was still navigating the rugged mountain roads. Thanks to the high clearance of their off-road vehicle, he could manage the rough terrain and eventually reached the lakeside safely. The rest of the journey required a barge, next to which a yacht was moored. Aaron went back to get help. Soon, he and his wife arrived with the barge and hurried to transport their supplies home before dark. Aaron loaded the vehicle and supplies onto the barge, and they set off. Due to shallow waters near the shore, the barge was somewhat submerged, forcing them to push it along with planks. By the time night fell completely, they had managed to move past the difficulty. The rest of the journey went smoothly, taking only about 10 minutes to reach their base camp. At that moment, Aaron could finally relax. Despite the upcoming long and harsh winter, they were prepared. Ray had hunted a David's deer, obtaining 660 pounds of meat. He spent the night in the wilderness. The next day, as dawn broke, Ray woke from sleep. He sighed at how long and cold the night had been. After a brief rest, he got busy. Today, he needed to safely transport the deer meat. To facilitate carrying, he decided to make a sled. He cut 2 similarly sized saplings for the sled's support poles, gathered some pine branches, and cut a few logs for crossbeams. He then assembled them. This type of zip tie was particularly handy. Ray, not a native mountain man, knew to modernize hunting practices, often using modern tools to increase efficiency. Before long, he had finished making the sled. Then, he loaded all the deer meat onto the sled, securing it tightly, and started off. pushing against the sled's crossbar with his waist. The journey back to his vehicle was about 5 miles, a real test of his stamina. The thick snow provided a surface for the sled to slide on, but also posed challenges. Ray took uneven steps. While momentum made pulling the sled easier, the deep snow made walking difficult. Restarting the sled once stopped was nearly impossible. Ray gasped for air, constantly pushing his physical limits while trying to move forward step by step. However, his stamina inevitably reached its limit. Finally, Ray stopped to catch his breath. After regaining his composure, he set off again. At that moment, he felt like a black ox, pulling a cart through unknown territories, bearing the weight of his load. The hardships kept coming, but with great effort, he managed to drag the sled up to the mountaintop. The journey downhill was next, and while he had hoped for relief, the descent proved challenging due to its momentum. Ray had to run passively, but fortunately, no accidents occurred. Exhausted, he was relieved to see his off-road vehicle ahead. He felt a transition from hell to heaven as he transferred all the meat to the vehicle and began the journey home. Soon after arriving, Ray carried the meat inside. Despite his exhaustion, the work was far from over. He needed to preserve the meat, key for surviving the winter. As a hunting guide, Ray respected every animal he killed, and utilizing every piece of meat was a form of high reverence. Salting the meat is an ancient tradition. Salt removes moisture from the meat and prevents parasites. Ray first poured salt at the bottom of a barrel, placed a piece of meat on it, then added another layer of salt, and repeated the process with more meat. Once the barrel was nearly full, he prepared brine. He boiled the brine and poured it into the barrel to cover all the meat. Next, he turned to the deer skin, using salt to remove moisture, a method for preserving the fur. He then processed the deer's head, which has some artistic value. First, he skinned it, separated the jawbones, and collected brain material, essential for tanning leather. Afterward, he cooked the skull to separate the meat perfectly, adding sodium carbonate to whiten the bones. The boiling process lasted several hours. As time ticked by, Ray felt it was time to finish. He removed the skull, cleaned off the remaining meat scraps, and placed the loose teeth on the table. Ray thoroughly enjoyed this lifestyle, filled with challenges and surprises every day. In Montana's Bishon Valley, Tom is set to teach his young apprentice today. Hank, the 10-year-old son of Tom's apprentice Sean, has developed a keen interest in outdoor life, much to Tom's delight. Tom is prepared to pass on all his knowledge. Today's lesson revolves around a fresh deer hide, teaching Hank the methods of leather tanning. Tom presents a finished piece to let Hank feel its soft texture, sparking his interest. After a brief explanation of the process, Tom takes out a scraper made from a steel blade bound to a deer's antler. With gentle scrapes, the hair comes off smoothly, accompanied by crisp sounds. Hank watches intently as the hair continuously falls. Once Hank is familiar with the process, Tom hands him another scraper to try it himself. In a pleasant atmosphere, the two continuously scrape the hide. After a while, the fur is almost completely removed, and Tom trims the edges with scissors. The skin is now rough and stiff and needs softening. Tom pours a bucket of water over the skin, preparing to soak it. They then break for lunch. Post-lunch, they return to the workshop, retrieve the deer hide from the water, and take it outside to drape over a wooden frame. Tom scrapes off the remaining fat to further clean it. Next, he soaks the hide in a tanning solution made from buffalo brain matter and hot water, containing enzymes that break down the skin tissue, making it soft. After soaking for 10 minutes, Tom hangs the hide on a pole and twists it to squeeze out the water. Back in the workshop, they make the leather even softer by pulling and stretching it. Because deer hide consists of fine, hair-like fibers, stretching alters the fiber structure, achieving the desired softness. Hank wants to join in and takes over Tom's task, busily working away. Tom watches amusedly, but soon Hank tires and Tom takes over again. After more stretching, the deer hide feels as soft as a blanket. Hank is amazed by the transformation and gains a deep admiration for Tom, like an endless river. He will remember this fascinating day. In Montana's Bishon Valley, a bearded man with a sharp knife takes a swipe at a badger's rear. This is the Salish Mountains of Montana. Paul is a hunter, hired by a ranch owner to help clear out predators that trouble the ranch, including this badger. Unlike nomadic tribes, badgers don't have fixed territories and constantly move. digging many burrows wherever they go. This can cause horses to trip, potentially resulting in broken legs or severe injuries. Thus, badgers are a primary enemy on the ranch. Paul's task allows him to earn a double income since badger fur can be sold. To perform better, he enlists an assistant, his son, Chauncey, a 20-year-old with a stylish beard who fell in love with hunting after moving to the countryside 3 years ago. The thrill of the hunt captivates him. Once prepared, the two set out. Badgers are tricky to catch not because they are clever, but because they are nomadic. Spotting their burrows is a matter of luck. While on the hunt, Paul and Chauncey stop at several holes that appear to be badger entrances. After careful inspection, Paul confirms these are indeed badger burrows but are abandoned. They continue and soon find several fresh burrows with clear paw prints, ideal for setting traps. Nearby, Paul finds a mouse hole and digs a pit at its entrance to bury a trap. Before placing the trap, he lays some wax sand underneath to absorb moisture and prevent the trap from freezing. However, wax sand can clog the trap, so Paul covers it with a sheet of paper followed by more sand until the trap is concealed. To ensure it looks natural, he sprinkles ordinary sand on top. The success of the trap also depends on bait made from mouse meat, which also attracts badgers. Now they are ready to set up other traps. Soon after, they found another badger burrow with a collapsed entrance. Chauncey was disappointed, but Paul chuckled. He explained to his son that the burrow was sealed by a badger sleeping inside as a form of protection. This time, Chauncey was in charge of setting the trap. He dug 2 pits nearby, planning to use a dual bait strategy to ensure at least one would attract the badger. Paul went to get the bait from the car. Just then, an accident occurred. Chauncey accidentally triggered a trap, snapping it shut on his hand. He yelled in pain. Fortunately, he was wearing thick gloves, which prevented a fracture. After calming down, he continued setting up the trap, this time with extra caution. Paul guided him through the next steps. Once they covered the trap with soil evenly, the first trap was set. In total, they set up 10 traps, including conibear traps. After laying a wide net of traps, they went home to wait. The next day, they checked the traps amid light snowfall as winter set in. Unfortunately, the first few traps were empty. They moved on and finally noticed a change at the next trap, which had been triggered. Paul used a shovel to widen the entrance while Chauncey pulled out a badger using the chain. Encouraged, they joyfully moved to the next location, which also brought a surprise: a female badger. Catching 2 female badgers today meant fewer badger litters next year, a significant impact. Elated, they went to report the good news to the ranch owner and collect their reward. On the other side, winter had arrived at Illiuk Lake, bringing threats from predators. Last night, they lost 2 dogs. Just when they were heartbroken, the dogs returned in the morning. Recently, wolf howls have been frequent, luring their dogs away. Gray wolves were once nearly hunted to extinction, so local protection policies were implemented. Today, the gray wolf population has rebounded, now posing a threat to ecological balance. To ensure safety, Aaron planned to build flash bombs with tripwires. He is an off-road mechanic with a well-stocked warehouse. The design of the flash bombs relies on a chain reaction. When a wolf trips the wire, it pulls a pin, releasing the firing pin of a shotgun, triggering an explosion to scare off the wolves. The critical component is the ammunition, a 12-gauge shell cut at the bottom. Then, a plastic plug is cut and inserted into the shell. After assembling the chamber, it was time to test it. Aaron gently pulled the string, and with a gunshot, the bullet swiftly ejected, looking formidable. Equipped, Aaron entered the woods, tying one end of the fishing line to a fallen tree and the other to a standing tree. He installed the firing device on this tree and threaded the fishing line through a hole, gently tying it to the launcher, then installed the bullet at the front of the device. Meanwhile, Jenny was splitting wood vigorously. Despite being a woman, her robust demeanor matched any man. Splitting wood was to build a bonfire, the best way to drive away wolves. When Aaron returned, having both completed their tasks, they shared an unexpected kiss, happy with their completed wolf defense setup. However, waiting passively wasn't Aaron's style. He rode his snowmobile to look for wolf tracks. After crossing the lake, he entered the dense forest on the opposite shore. There was a small path convenient for the snowmobile, but soon a fallen tree blocked the way. Clear wolf tracks in the snow indicated the correct direction. Aaron cleared a new path and continued forward. After a while, he stopped. The wolf tracks led into a chaotic area. Next, Aaron could only proceed on foot. Carrying a shotgun and holding an axe, he resolutely walked on. Following these traces, he found a kill site, seemingly a coyote that had hidden here to avoid the wolves, but unfortunately, it had met its end. Aaron worried about his wife's safety and started his journey back. A terrifying wolf howl was heard, followed by the sound of a flash bomb. It seemed a wolf had triggered the tripwire. After reuniting with his wife at home, they both armed themselves and entered the forest. They quickly reached the scene where they found wolf tracks in the snow, but the wolves had disappeared. Aaron repaired the alarm device and then adjusted the wood by the fire to burn better. Then they returned home. This is their unpredictable yet thrilling life, outdoors. Jake and his wife Annika hunted a David's deer, gaining nearly 300 pounds of meat. It was Annika's first time hunting a large animal, which left her very satisfied, though Jake felt somewhat unfulfilled. The next day, he stepped out of the tent, looked at his wife's catch, and decided to hunt on his own. They planned to climb to a highland to look for game. Understanding her competitive new husband, Annika happily followed him. Soon, they reached the summit and started scanning the surroundings. Jake, an experienced hunter, surveyed the area expertly, but saw nothing. It was Annika, the novice, who spotted the prey. Following her direction, Jake finally saw a sizable group of David's deer grazing. They quickly followed to keep the deer from moving. When they reached the base of the hill, they stopped to avoid startling the deer. Jake tracked the prey alone while Annika stayed back, observing through binoculars. The wind was in their favor, preventing the deer from smelling their presence. Jake, taking advantage of the favorable conditions, got within rifle range. He put earplugs in and approached slowly. The deer, sensing danger, stood up. In that moment, Jake set up his rifle within 3 seconds. Annika watched nervously as the deer began to panic. Jake fired, and with a loud bang, a David's deer fell while the others ran off. Jake aimed, considering a second shot, but seeing the deer motionless, he knew the hunt was successful. Annika joyfully approached, and they both inspected the prey, a mature doe. With today's catch, Jake had hunted 2 David's deer and 1 white-tailed deer, securing ample food for the winter. As the saying goes, men and women working together makes the task easier. The couple quickly dismembered the David's deer, and each carried 100 pounds of meat to start their journey back. The sight of them working in harmony was very peaceful. By evening, they were still on the road because the hunting spot was quite far from their truck, and the heavy load significantly slowed their pace. Annika, tired in body and mind, felt unsteady on her feet. Just when they felt completely exhausted, they finally saw their truck. They made a final effort to reach it and leaned against it, wishing they could just stay there. Unfortunately, they couldn't rest just yet as another David's deer awaited transportation at the camp. After a brief rest, they hit the road again. Despite their fatigue, they experienced what could be called joyful suffering as they talked lovingly and pushed forward. They made it back to the truck just before dark, concluding a very successful hunting trip. Elated, the pair headed home. A few days later, Jake finally had his first business of the year. As a lion hunter, he was responsible for driving off mountain lions that wandered into ranches. Several days of heavy snowfall had made it difficult for the mountain lions to find prey, leading them to come down to the ranches. Soon, Jake spotted a trail of lion tracks in the snow. From the footprints, it was clear that it was a mature mountain lion, a challenging adversary. But Jake was well prepared today, bringing along 5 experienced hunting dogs. They quickly chased after the lion in one direction, while Jake followed slowly behind. The deep snow made his movements difficult, and he struggled to keep up. After 2 hours, which was usually enough time to near his target, he realized he was far behind. Feeling exhausted, he took a break and checked his GPS, discovering that the dogs had stopped at a certain spot, seemingly having cornered the mountain lion. To avoid any mishaps, Jake needed to get there as quickly as possible. Inspired, he found new energy and strode forward. After a while, he finally heard the dogs barking triumphantly. Overjoyed, he hurried toward them. But soon, he stopped as the barking abruptly ceased. He checked his GPS and saw that the dogs were on the move again. likely because the mountain lion had jumped down from a tree and chosen to flee again. Jake was very concerned about the safety of his hunting dogs. Without his command, they would not stop the hunt, and climbing higher posed greater risks. Prolonged tracking could exhaust the dogs. It wasn't long before he reached the spot where the dogs had been standing. The ground beneath the tree was covered with chaotic footprints, and claw marks from the mountain lion were visible on the tree trunk. Just then he heard a burst of urgent barking from a distance, indicating that they had cornered the mountain lion again. Jake needed to hurry over. They were now far enough from the ranch, and the chase had been going on for 4 hours. It was time to end it. Catching up as fast as he could, Jake finally saw the mountain lion trembling in a tree, with several fierce hunting dogs standing below. Jake was very pleased with their performance. The mountain lion looked distressed, likely leaving a lasting impression that would deter it from coming down the mountain anytime soon. This was exactly Jake's goal. The day's task of driving the mountain lion away was perfectly accomplished. It was time for him and his dogs to head home and enjoy their dinner. In a remote forest, a man named Ray, a hunter living in Washington's Lake Mountains, dragged a dead deer to an open area. He used a small knife to cut the deer's belly, exposing fresh meat. Amidst falling heavy snow, adding a mysterious aura to the grim scene, Ray was fulfilling a rancher's request to eliminate wild animals threatening the ranch. Due to the rising coyote population, lacking natural predators, Ray's task was to either kill some female coyotes or chase away the males to prevent mating. Deep in the woods was a cabin, Ray's destination, where he planned to stay until the breeding season ended. Satisfied with this shelter, Ray noticed deer fur under the cabin's deck and a body nearby. Approaching, he found a young deer killed by coyotes, left uneaten, likely to be returned to when they were hungry. Ray decided to use the deer as bait to lure other coyotes. He loaded the deer onto a sled and headed towards a mountain peak, knowing the coyotes' active spots. Soon, he reached a small valley, a favorite spot for coyotes, where he could watch from a higher vantage point. After studying the terrain, Ray dragged the deer to the valley's bottom and opened its entrails, spreading the scent to attract nearby coyotes, knowing this would take some time. While Ray set up traps nearby, according to Washington state laws, wolf hunting is only permitted using live traps, not snares. This is because if a protected animal is accidentally caught, it can be released unharmed. The trap was ready-made and only needed assembling. Ray covered the ground with hay to hide the presence of wire nets. He then gathered branches and wood to fully conceal the trap, making it look very natural. The success of the trap depended on the bait. Ray took out a snowshoe hare, smeared its blood on the ground to spread the scent, and then threw the rabbit deep into the cage. However, because coyotes are cunning and smart, any inconsistency could arouse suspicion. Ray sprayed a special perfume made of fish oil, wolf urine, and skunk fluid at the entrance to mask human odors and create the illusion that other animals had been there, confusing the coyote. But that was not all. To attract the prey, he needed a visual impact. He tied a CD to a tree with fishing line so that when sunlight hit, the CD would reflect light and attract distant coyotes' attention. Now, he could leave. Before it got dark, he set another trap and waited for evening when coyotes began to be active. Ray had already set 2 traps and now headed towards the bait. To avoid startling the wildlife, he slowed down and kept quiet. Before long, he reached a high point with a natural barrier and looked towards the bait. There was no movement on the path yet, but a hunter's basic quality is patience, along with some techniques. He took out a whistle and started mimicking the cries of a dying animal. This mournful tune sounded particularly eerie in the silent wilderness, but was enticing to predators. They would hurry over, but after waiting a while with no targets appearing, Ray felt discouraged. Today might yield nothing. Just as he was about to give up, a figure flashed by. Ray quickly grabbed his rifle, and sure enough, it was a coyote. He decisively fired and hit the target. Ray did not act rashly, but waited until it was completely dark before stopping his watch and running towards the target. There lay a coyote on the snow, already stiff from the cold. He dragged the coyote back to the cabin, marking a good start to the day. Running a ranch is not an easy task. Tagging an unruly calf requires the effort of at least 2 strong men. This is the Granite Mountains in Nevada, located 400 miles south of the Sawtooth Mountains. Here Dusty, the father of Harry and Gideon, runs his ranch with about 50 cattle. However, due to workers leaving this year, he is left alone and calls his sons for help. This area is a high desert, filled with depressions and alkali soil, and has relatively dense vegetation, making it ideal for cattle grazing. The land is owned by the government and can only be leased by ranchers. To distinguish their property, each cow must be branded. During the summer, the cattle graze freely in the mountains and the newborn calves are unbranded. They need to find the calves quickly before the government does, otherwise Dusty could lose thousands of dollars. Led by several sheepdogs, they finally locate the herd. After a brief rest, they start a grand chase. The sheepdogs lead the charge towards the cattle, causing them to panic and run. The men spread out and continuously correct the direction of the herd, using tactics similar to those of wolves, which divide and conquer during hunts. The cattle can only run along a predetermined route until they finally return to the ranch. The men block the gate and start counting. There are 42 cattle, 2 are missing. So Harry and Gideon head back to the mountains to look for the lost cattle. Although there are no tall trees, the terrain is complex and bushy, making it difficult to spot hidden cattle. Harry uses binoculars and is lucky to spot the target. They immediately chase after and calm the calves by shouting. As they get closer, they find the mother cow is also nearby and joyfully drive both cattle back to the ranch. But the work is not over. They heat an iron in the fire and start selecting their targets, while their elderly father adds wood to the fire. Calves are generally branded at the age of 5 months, a mark that lasts forever. The 2 men position themselves separately and release any cows that do not meet the criteria. After counting, 6 calves need to be branded today. Now there are fewer cattle in the pen. Gideon seals the gate to ensure there are no issues before they begin their work. Harry took the lead, quickly lassoing the neck of the calf. However, this young black calf was stubborn by nature. Even as it foamed at the mouth from the lasso's pressure, it refused to submit. Seeing this, Gideon skillfully captured the calf's hind legs. Dusty approached immediately with the branding iron. They held the calf down and forcefully branded it, causing a puff of white smoke to rise, accompanied by the smell of burning. The calf bolted away as soon as it was released. They continued this process with the other calves, marking each one in the same manner. It was only after branding that these calves truly became their property. After a busy period, only 1 calf was left. Harry and Gideon's teamwork improved, making it easy to catch and subdue this last calf, rewarding it with a brand. The long day finally ended. The next day, as the sun rose, they started a new round of work. Yesterday, they had retrieved 44 cattle, but at least 6 were still deep in the mountains. Their task today was to find these remaining cattle. The terrain was steep and icy, so they replaced their horses' shoes with special iron shoes for better traction, much like fitting snow tires on a vehicle. Harry checked the size and found it perfect. After fitting the shoes, the horse showed no discomfort, and they set off prepared. Due to the long distance, they drove to the base of the mountain and then mounted their horses from the trailer without delay. The mountain roads were rugged and the horses could fall at any moment, but thankfully, the sharp-studded shoes prevented accidents. Unfortunately, as they advanced, the mountain roads became steeper, and they still couldn't see any cattle. Just as they were growing anxious, they finally spotted cattle hoof prints on the ground. Following the prints, they quickly caught up and soon saw several cattle among the mountain rocks. The sheepdogs immediately went to work. They were well trained to cooperate with their owners and harass the cattle, guiding them in the right direction. Because the mountain was full of rocks, the horses couldn't speed up, so the sheepdogs were the main force in herding the cattle today. However, the cattle were notoriously temperamental and resisted from time to time. After a continuous tug of war, they gradually moved down the mountain and eventually reached the trailer, successfully driving the cattle into the pen. The 2 men then proceeded to brand the remaining calves. This round of work was successfully completed, and they could return home. A tall tree fell straight down in the direction of the roar of the chainsaw. The tree was cut down because it was in the wrong place, too close to the homestead. This is the remote area of Iligolik Lake where Aran and Jenny have settled. Today, with clear weather, they aim to clear the surrounding hazards. Nearby dead trees, often called widowmakers, are risky because they can fall during the fierce winter winds. It is safest to cut them down. Now, 2 more dead trees need to be cut. They controlled the direction, safely bringing down the trees. Only one tree remains. Suddenly, the weather changed, and a blizzard could hit at any moment. The last tree was the most challenging as it was right next to the house. A poor direction could destroy the house, and solar panels in the other direction were also at risk. After strategizing due to a short cable, they used a pulley system connecting the tree and a jeep with a stump. As the wind picked up, they just finished setting up the system. With the jeep started, the cable tightened. Aaron immediately started the chainsaw, cutting a triangular notch on one side of the tree, then cutting straight in slightly higher on the backside. The tree's base became unstable, and it began to sway significantly. Aaron quickly signaled, and the jeep kept backing up. Together, they brought the tree down, narrowly missing the eaves. They sighed in relief. Aaron inspected the trunk and found several pine beetles, explaining why the pine had died. This pest, known as the pine tree's nemesis, feeds on the tree's bark and can kill the tree within a year. Now that the hazard was resolved, they could rest easy. In Montana's Bison River Valley, today was the last day of deer hunting season, but only ancient weapons were allowed. Tom held an old-fashioned Horton rifle, once commonly used by mountain men. Although it only fires once, its power is sufficient to kill a bison. Sean and Hank also joined this operation, a form of tradition. Tom explained the rifle's performance to Hank, pouring some black powder from a storage antler into the barrel, then pushing a lead ball in with a tool, and finally compressing the ball onto the powder with a long stick. The bullet was now ready. Tom tested it with a stand, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot broke the silence. Tom used a telescope to confirm the hit on the target. The rifle was functioning well, and they set off in the car. After a while, they arrived at the Kootenai Forest. The weather was clear today, perfect for hunting. Tom and Sean each carried a rifle and entered the forest, filled with anticipation. Nothing beats the pleasure of fresh deer meat in winter. For this hunt, Sean had previously scouted the area and set up a blind. They just needed to hide inside and wait quietly for deer to appear. Deer are very alert animals with keen senses of smell, vision, and hearing. Any slight disturbance could startle them. Tom shared tips with Hank, such as turning your head slowly and maintaining a stealthy demeanor to confuse the prey. Patience, he explained, was crucial, sometimes requiring sitting quietly for hours. This approach soon paid off when a deer appeared in their sight. It was unaware of the danger and was focused on eating. Although they saw the deer, they did not shoot because the regulations only allowed hunting bucks at this time, and the deer was a doe. They watched regretfully as it walked away, followed by a long wait of 3 hours without seeing a buck. At this point, they decided to change strategy. Tom stayed put while Sean and his son went out to possibly drive a deer to him. Tom could see a doe lying in the snow, which might attract a buck. Meanwhile, Sean and his son reached another area, sat down beside a large tree, and started clashing antlers together. This mimicked the sound of bucks fighting, a tactic used to exploit the buck's jealousy to win over a doe. If there were any bucks in the area, they would come running towards the sound, enraged. Soon after, a young buck appeared. Sean observed carefully and returned to camp to tell Tom the good news. Tom quickly manipulated the antlers, sending out a rapid, intense sound. The buck followed the sound. They held their breath, waiting for the buck to move into a favorable position. The opportunity was brief. Seeing the buck pause, Tom took his shot decisively. Unfortunately, the buck did not fall, but walked away with small, hurried steps, leaving 3 men looking at each other in confusion. They went to check, and found no blood in the snow but a clear bullet mark on a nearby tree trunk. Perhaps it was fate. The buck's life was not meant to end. As it was getting late, they decided to end the hunt. Although the result was not ideal, enjoying the process was also a significant part of hunting's allure. This woman is stronger than a Bishon. She is fishing, and in the water, a large fish is struggling desperately. Despite its wild efforts, the woman firmly controls it and eventually scoops it up with a net. It's a tasty lake trout. While Jenny is happy, her thoughts drift to her husband, Aaron. It was a dim morning when Aaron started preparing to go hunting in the mountains to stock up on food for the winter. The couple lives by Lake Iliamna in the north, relying entirely on nature for food. Today, Aaron's target is a moose, which lives in the marshlands. Moose are large, averaging over 1,000 pounds, and can yield about 500 pounds of meat, enough to sustain a family through the long winter. However, moose are notoriously difficult to catch. 3 miles from his home, there's an open meadow, a known moose haunt. Moose have poor eyesight but excellent hearing, able to detect sounds from 2 miles away. After patrolling, Aaron finds some moose droppings, which boosts his morale. He advances to a higher ground and uses his rifle scope to scan the meadow for moose. Unfortunately, he finds none. Aaron decides to use a seductive tactic. He mimics the call of a female moose during the mating season. This enticing sound could make a male moose think it's his lucky day. Aaron just needs to stay put, and the male moose will come right to him. He now holds a horn made from birch bark, producing a deep, long sound. Now, it's a waiting game. While her husband is busy hunting, Jenny is also productive. Since hunting involves luck and one shouldn't put all eggs in one basket, Jenny turns to fishing for food. The lake is their treasure, teeming with fish, with lake trout being a staple. In summer, although they rely on the lake, fishing is restricted to 3 fish per day as food. It doesn't take long for Jenny to complete today's task. She prepares to smoke the fish meat using red lacquer tree trunks, which emit a special smoke when burned, giving the smoked meat a delicious aroma. Jenny chops the trunks into pieces to help her smolder them while maintaining low heat to avoid cooking the meat directly. Then, she sprinkles some salt on the fish meat, places it in the smoker, and smokes it for about 5 hours. Meanwhile, Aaron was still on his hunting trip. He found many signs of moose activity, but still saw no moose. As time ticked away, he felt uncertain. Once again, he mimicked the call of a moose, hoping for a response. He scanned the meadow again, and finally, a figure appeared. Aaron watched intently, but felt a pang of heartache. Although it was a male moose, it was too far away. He needed it to be within 200 yards to shoot. He mimicked the call of a female moose again, trying to lure it closer, but the moose ignored the call and slowly walked away, leaving Aaron disheartened as the sky darkened. It seemed his moose hunting plan had to be abandoned, but he would not return empty-handed. He walked into the forest and quickly found a target, a ptarmigan, dazed on a tree. A bullet ended its reverie. Though it was pitiful, it was not lonely, as a second ptarmigan was also killed by Aaron. It seemed as if they were in love, and now they were together in fate. Satisfied, Aaron headed home. In the Blue Ridge Mountains, Eustace leads a self-sufficient life, but still needs to buy some essentials. The fresh hay is for the horses' winter food, stored in the barn for use when it snows. Here, neighbors help each other. Today, it was Eustace's turn to repay a favor. He decided the best way was through sharing knowledge. For years, his neighbor James had been asking how to train horses, a priceless skill that Eustace hesitated to teach. James runs a small farm with 3 stallions. His children are eager to train the horses, hence his interest. Eustace delayed because James's horses are stallions, a challenging and unpredictable task despite his decades of experience. Eustace carefully approached, placed the harness on the horse, and the process went smoothly. He began explaining basics, such as horses dislike anything that covers their eyes and training should be gradual. Through simple commands, the horse would learn who is in charge. Seeing the horse comply, they prepared for the next lesson. Just outside, the brown horse suddenly screamed as if startled, trying to break free. At that critical moment, a dog rushed up, barked fiercely, and calmed the horse quickly. Eustace advised his neighbor to take it slow. This incident didn't deter James, who continued with the remaining lessons, and the brown horse became increasingly obedient. Now, they were ready to move on to the next step. The two saddled the horse without any reaction from it, indicating a smooth process. However, for safety, they continued to walk the horse around before riding. A foundation of trust had been established, and the crucial moment followed. Eustace stepped into the stirrup and, after a few tries, smoothly mounted the horse. Fortunately, the horse did not struggle, making for a smooth start. Then, James instructed him to slowly back up, but the brown horse seemed nervous, so they stopped and switched to moving forward instead. The horse performed exceptionally well. Given its obedience, James let go of the reins, allowing Eustace to ride alone. Following commands, the horse could back up, move forward, and circle, all completed in a docile manner. Achieving this level in one day not only demonstrated Eustace's expertise, but also the horse's quality. The next day, they continued with training exercises. After fully equipping the horse, they brought it to the training ground, walked it around to familiarize it with the new gear, then attached a sled and continued walking. Once it adapted to the pace, Eustace stepped onto the sled, marking the end of the training. The brown horse graduated with perfect marks and would spend its life alternating between carrying people and pulling carts, becoming a proud working horse. This was a trap for catching wolves, using a small white rabbit as bait. Ray, a bounty hunter, was assigned to guard a ranch. He set up 2 traps and shot a coyote. 2 weeks had passed since that day in the Washington Cascades. As winter deepened and temperatures fell below freezing, food became scarce, prompting coyotes to continually harass the ranch. Therefore, Ray patrolled daily. As usual, he first checked the traps, but found nothing, not even the bait. Not giving up, Ray searched around. Local laws prohibited the use of lethal traps for hunting, allowing only live traps like cages, which are much harder to use. After 2 weeks, he hadn't caught anything. Upon inspection, Ray found that the cold weather had frozen the trigger mechanism. After fixing it, he tested the trap again, and this time it successfully closed. Ray smiled, ready to fetch a new bait. As night fell, predators began to roam. Ray had finished repairing the traps and was ready to take proactive measures. He found a fresh coyote track and followed it slowly to avoid startling anything, staying vigilant and listening carefully. Soon he spotted a target, crouched down, and aimed. The coyote had not sensed the threat. Ray decisively fired his gun, shattering the silence. He quickly ran to the spot where the coyote had been standing, but it was empty. The coyote had run off in that direction. Ray decided to follow and soon found the coyote, which had stopped breathing. He stroked its soft fur, hoping its spirit would return to nature. Checking its gender, he discovered it was female, which pleased him since hunting female coyotes helps control their population. Ray carried the coyote back, humming a tune as he returned to his cabin. The next day, with the sun shining, he set out to fix the cabin. When he first arrived, he noticed deer fur under the deck, a clear sign they used it as a warm den. The presence of deer would attract coyotes, so Ray decided to seal off this area to prevent future issues. He used a drill to connect 2 wooden boards, then nailed them to the cabin's frame. Using the same method, he installed 2 beams and then moved on to attaching the panels. With the whirring of the drill, he secured the aluminum panels to the beams. Before long, he had finished installing the front and moved on to the more challenging side, needing to cut the panels to size before fixing them in place. Satisfied with his work, Ray felt very pleased, but he still had one task left: processing the coyote he had killed the day before. He skinned the coyote, knowing its pelt could sell for $200, although this one was heavily damaged and would likely fetch less. However, for Ray, this was sufficient as the ranch owner would give him a generous bonus. He loved his job and preferred the quiet mountain life to the city's hustle, finding deep satisfaction in it. His mission completed, Ray planned to return home the next day. In Montana's Tobacco Mountains, Jake is a lion hunter responsible for driving away mountain lions that threaten ranches. After a heavy snowfall, the challenges posed by mountain lions intensified, making it essential for the hunting dogs to give their all. To cope with the thick snow, Jake came prepared, bringing his snowmobile from home and attaching a sled to it. He also moved the dog kennels onto the sled to allow the dogs more rest and cover more area. Now, Jake headed towards the active area of the mountain lion. After some time, he stopped upon spotting a lion's footprint in the snow, which he identified as from the previous night. The lion had sheltered overnight in an abandoned mine and left early in the morning in that direction. It was time for the hunting dogs, as the scent of the mountain lion filled the air. Upon release, they eagerly rushed out, sprinting in one direction, while Jake continued on the main road on his snowmobile. As he moved into more remote areas, the snow deepened, forcing Jake to stop. He detached the sled, leaving it behind, and proceeded alone on the snowmobile. The snow's thickness exceeded expectations as he ascended the steep slope, causing the snowmobile to get stuck. Amidst his frustration, he heard the dogs barking urgently. They had cornered the mountain lion. Using his GPS, he found they were on the other side of the ridge. Ignoring the snowmobile, Jake set out on foot. Approaching a dangerous situation, Jake knew the cornered lion, especially being young, could pose a significant risk to the dogs. Upon reaching the site, he found several dogs surrounding a tree with a young mountain lion perched above, intently watching. The lion, still honing its hunting skills, had targeted easier prey, leading to this chase. Believing it was in hostile territory, the lion likely learned a lesson and would hesitate to descend the mountain soon. As Jake prepared to leave with the dogs, the young lion impulsively fled, prompting another chase. Fortunately, the pursuit lasted only about 200 yards before the lion climbed another tree. This time, Jake managed to control the dogs, ending the day's task. They returned to the snowmobile, where Jake cleared the surrounding snow and eventually freed the vehicle. The rest of the journey went smoothly, and they reached the sled. After reassembling it, Jake loaded the dogs into their kennels and headed back to the truck, ready to enjoy his dinner after a fulfilling day. This is a beautiful deer, violently dragged by a man who then uses a small knife to cut open its belly and reaches inside, digging around. This horrifying scene occurred in Montana's Salish Mountains. Paul, a hunter who relies on hunting to make a living, got up early before dawn, grabbed his equipment, and headed deep into the mountains. With daylight being short in the winter, he needed to make the most of every moment. It wasn't long before he reached his destination and continued on foot. Paul's target was a 2-year-old buck, mature yet tender and with an exceptional taste. Deer tracks were everywhere in the snow, a very good sign. Below was a fertile valley, an active area for white-tailed deer, especially during the mating season when they naturally gather. This meant bucks were likely present in the valley. Paul had been hunting deer since he was just 11 years old, an experience that left an indelible memory and made him fall in love with this lifestyle. As he advanced, he suddenly stopped at some strange patterns in the snow, traces left by an eagle during a hunt, with some grouse feathers nearby. This is the harsh reality of nature, where killings happen daily. After reflecting on this, he continued searching for deer. After traveling some distance, he stopped again at the sight of blood in the snow, deducing it came from a deer with drag marks nearby. He immediately followed the trail through a dense pine forest, moving slowly and alert for any sudden appearance of wild animals. Fortunately, his concerns were unnecessary. He found a deer, half-eaten, in the bushes. The clues suggested a lynx was the predator, which hunts by leaping onto a deer's back, locking its neck with its claws, and biting its carotid artery, a very efficient method that suffocates the prey within minutes. Seeing such a formidable competitor spurred the competitive Paul. Hungry and eager, he eventually spotted a deer through his binoculars, but it was a doe, and not what he was looking for. However, during mating season, the presence of a doe meant a buck would be nearby. Paul just needed to tap into the animal's instincts. Bucks become very aggressive as they fight for a mate, so Paul hid behind a tree, took out 2 antlers, and started clashing them together, simulating the sound of bucks fighting. Any nearby buck hearing this noise would likely come to join the battle for the doe. It wasn't long before some rustling came from the bushes across the way. It might have been a dollar. Paul immediately approached. He crouched behind a tree and looked closely. It indeed was a buck. He couldn't miss this opportunity. Just as he was about to shoot, the buck moved behind a tree. Paul quickly changed positions, but still couldn't find a clear shot. So he moved rapidly to another tree. This time, he could see the buck, and it had just stopped. In a swift moment, Paul pulled the trigger. Although the buck ran, he was certain his shot had hit the target. He walked over with confidence and, sure enough, found the buck not far away, motionless. After admiring it briefly, Paul dragged the deer to an open area, then gutted it and removed the perishable organs. Afterward, he returned for his snowmobile, loaded the deer onto the sled, and set off back home, his spirits high. This season was off to a perfect start. In Idaho's Sawtooth Mountains, when the first snow falls, the 10,000-foot peaks become extraordinarily dangerous. But Harry and Gideon, who grew up here, are as comfortable in this harsh nature as fish in water. Today, they received an order. A customer had a remote ranch in the mountains, inaccessible by car, reachable only by horse or plane. Their task was simple: get there and create a makeshift airstrip. It was said there used to be an airstrip, but it had been abandoned for 10 years. The exact situation would only be clear upon arrival. However, the steep mountain roads were beyond imagination. A slight misstep could cause irreparable damage. The two kept a constant watch and chose the safest route. As they traveled, an eagle soared overhead, perfectly embodying the isolation of the mountains. With great effort, they finally reached the ranch. The area was overgrown with weeds, making it hard to discern where the old airstrip was. However, an old plow was on the grass, presumably for clearing the runway. Gideon inspected it and felt it could still be used. Today, the main labor was 2 draft horses. After attaching the equipment and connecting them to the plow, the 2 men sat on the cart, one in front and the other behind. At a command, the horses began to move. Once it was confirmed the wheels could turn normally, Harry lowered a metal blade, achieving an instant snow-clearing effect. The airstrip needed to be over 300 meters long and sufficiently clean and smooth to ensure the safe landing of small aircraft. The ground was frozen and hard, and the uneven spots added much resistance, making it tough for the horses. Harry suddenly yelled a few times, urging the horses to stop quickly because the plow's wheel was about to come off. Upon inspection, they found that a gear fixing the axle had dislocated. Harry resecured the part, and they continued working. After a busy period, the runway was cleared of snow, but the job wasn't done yet. They used tools to fill in small holes, eliminating any hazards. Now the runway work was complete. They used the radio to inform the client. Shortly after, a plane appeared on the horizon. The first supply shipment had arrived. The plane landed smoothly on the runway and came to a steady stop after a short run. After greetings, they helped unload the supplies. The client expressed gratitude to them once again. Now they could head home. The man, resembling a butcher, carried 2 bloody bodies. After applying a secret seasoning, he put them into a blender. As the machine operated, sausage-like red meat emerged from the outlet. This is the Salish Mountains in Montana, known for its rich wildlife and dubbed a hunter's paradise. Paul, a professional hunter, had set some beaver traps earlier and planned to check them today, aiming to also catch some muskrat. His neighbor's pond had recently been damaged by rodents, including a beaver family that had made it their home base, severely disrupting the ecosystem. Thus, the neighbor sought his help. Paul gladly accepted the task, benefiting from both fur and meat, achieving a win-win situation. He soon reached his destination. The traps had been set a week ago, and during this time he had caught 3 beavers. However, as the weather turned colder, the pond began to freeze, affecting the trapping efficiency. Paul first measured the ice thickness, finding it thinner where vegetation was present, which was relatively dangerous. He cautiously proceeded, measuring the depth occasionally with tools to ensure he wouldn't fall into the water. Safely reaching the first trap, he removed the newly formed ice layer, then lifted the trap, revealing a beaver. Overjoyed, Paul struggled to lift it. To avoid damaging the fur, he enlarged the hole and easily pulled out the beaver, ice clinging to its body. He knocked the ice off and admired the beaver, noting its glossy, high-quality appearance. He left it there and went to check the other traps. The ice kept creaking under the strain. With utmost care, he reached the second trap, which had caught an otter, an unintended yet delightful catch. Otters are carnivores that had come to hunt muskrat but ended up in the trap. Their lush fur makes them relatively expensive. Excited, Paul prepared for his second task of the day, trapping some muskrat. Muskrat, a small rodent with dual-layered fur, stays warm in icy waters, making their fur highly valuable. Paul began searching for a spot to set traps. The reed beds were active areas for muskrat, but the ice there was dangerously thin. As he tapped the ice and moved forward, he accidentally fell through, his right leg plunging into an ice hole, causing him to gasp from the pain. After catching his breath, he slowly stood up, fortunately close to his destination. Ahead was a raised snow mound with a hollow at the top, a sign of underwater animal activity, indicating a muskrat den. Paul dug a small hole on the side, reached in, and removed some weeds. He then took out a trap, tied it to a stick, inserted it into the hole, and fixed the stick horizontally at the entrance. He covered it back up with snow to restore its original appearance, completing a bait trap. He planned to set a few more traps. By evening, Paul had finished his tasks for the day. Before heading home, he decided to check the first trap, knowing that sometimes trapping can be successful within just a few minutes. With anticipation, Paul arrived at the trap, opened the entrance, and reached inside. Sure enough, he felt a catch. Upon pulling it out, he saw it was indeed a muskrat. Paul was very pleased, thinking its beautiful fur would make a fine hat. He reset the trap, hoping for more luck tomorrow. With today's catch in hand, Paul happily headed home. However, the work was not over. He needed to quickly skin the animal to obtain the best quality fur. On the wall hung many examples of muskrat fur, and the processing of beaver was similar. First, he made cuts around the beaver's limbs to separate the fur, then cut off its tail, which could be used to make sheaths, also fetching a good price. Next, he cut out the beaver's scent glands, excellent material for making bait, as beavers communicate via scents. After removing these parts, Paul skinned the beaver. Finally, he handled the beaver meat, which was not suitable for human consumption, but had other uses. Paul applied a special powder to the meat and placed it in a grinder. As the machine worked furiously, sausage-like red meat emerged from the outlet, used as bait for trapping wild animals. Paul packaged it in batches and sold it nationwide to make money. In Montana's Bison Valley, the snow brought a new drop in temperature. Tom cleared the road in front of his house, spreading salt to melt the ice, then prepared for today's work. A week ago, he and his 10-year-old son, Hank, had tanned a deer hide. After days of tanning, the leather was now ready. It was time to make it into clothing. Tom and Nancy had discussed making a vest for Hank from this leather. Both were fond of the youngster. They began by drawing the pattern to Hank's size, then cut the leather into several pieces that together formed a vest. The next step was sewing. To add aesthetic appeal, they planned to incorporate some decorations on the leather, requiring a double layer. Nancy glued 2 pieces of leather together. Tom punched holes in them, and they sewed them together using thread. Lastly, they used glass beads as decorations, sewing them on to create a beautiful finish. As time passed, the decorations were gradually perfected. Nancy continued her work while Tom went to find a deer antler to make some buttons. His workshop stored many deer antlers from which he selected the highest quality piece. He secured it to the workbench and used a steel saw to cut it into several pieces. Tom was very dedicated to Hank's gift, hoping it would provide him with fond memories as he grew up. Such primitive artwork is unforgettable. The day was nearly over when Sean and Hank arrived home, and the gift was already prepared. At the sight of the vest, Hank exclaimed in amazement. The gift was incredibly cool. With Tom's help, he immediately tried on the vest, his face beaming with happiness. He loved the vest so much that he planned to wear it to school the next day to show it off. Alan had fashioned a homemade ice-cutting tool by attaching a chainsaw to a metal frame. The stability of the frame ensured that the chainsaw could cut in a straight line. They went to such lengths solely for survival. They lived by Lake Iliamna in remote northern Alaska, relying mainly on natural resources. During the cold winter, they needed to fill their ice cellar, which would function like a freezer in the summer. For this, they first cleared the snow from the ice, then used tools to draw a straight line. They started the chainsaw and made a 2-inch deep notch at the beginning. However, to cut in a straight line, they needed to use a tool for assistance. Alan attached the chainsaw to a handmade jig to angle it correctly. After starting the chainsaw, he slowly inserted the blade into the ice, while Jenny pulled and Alan pushed, working seamlessly together. When they reached the end of the cut, they turned the frame in another direction and continued cutting the ice in the same manner. This task was arduous and fraught with danger. A misstep could lead to injury, and given the remote location, a severe injury could mean death. Despite the risks, they cut ice every year because it was the only way to preserve food. After a busy period, 200 ice blocks had been carved out, but the hardest part was just beginning, removing the ice blocks. Alan frowned, unsure of how to proceed. He chose one block to smash first. He swung a pickaxe vigorously, chipping away at the ice and removing the debris until a cubic space was cleared. They could not dig any deeper. Although the ice was typically 1 meter thick at this time of year, they dared not risk breaking through the ice layer, as a breach could cause the lake water to overflow, potentially sinking the entire grid and negating all their hard work. Alan knocked down the adjacent ice blocks through the ice hole. Jenny then used large tongs to lift them out. Both were excited as the first block of ice was successfully retrieved. What followed was a repetitive process, but the danger remained. As the hole enlarged, Alan had to step down into it, worried that the remaining ice might not support his weight. Despite the risks, he proceeded, and thankfully, the ice was solid enough for him to safely harvest the blocks. Soon, a sled was filled. The pair then returned to transfer the ice blocks to their cellar, an 8 by 8 meter structure lined with insulation. They arranged the ice blocks tightly against one another to ensure the base was solid so the upper layers would not collapse. As time passed, their progress continued steadily. They repeated the mechanical motion, filling a sled, transporting it to the cellar and placing each block in its precise position. Due to the varying sizes of the ice blocks, many cracks appeared during arrangement, so Alan filled the larger gaps with crushed ice. As the height of the stacked ice increased, the task became more challenging, requiring more physical effort. The progress was smooth, with 2/3 of the space filled, but daylight was dwindling and their energy was depleting. Alan's swings with the pickaxe grew weaker. According to their pace, they might not finish today. However, the weather was expected to warm up starting tomorrow, and if the ice cellar wasn't filled, the ice would melt faster. They had to take a risk. Alan used a chainsaw to cut at the base of the ice, which allowed them to harvest blocks more easily, greatly saving time. Before darkness fell, they had filled the entire ice cellar. Both finally took a deep breath, relieved. This was their simple life, filled with challenges. Meanwhile, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Eustace was experiencing a different climate. He was driving south to a city, a rare trip for him. His destination was Beaufort, South Carolina, where his friend Jess operated a farm and was now interested in acquiring a sawmill. A local sawmill was for sale, so he called on experienced Eustace to help evaluate it. The two shared a warm embrace. Jess is a construction worker skilled in various carpentry tasks, and the elderly man with limited mobility is the seller. He owns an old sawmill machine that still looks good on the outside. Eustace began his inspection, noting that the machine was about 90 years old and had been outdoors for a while, so some issues were to be expected. Rust was just a minor problem among these. They added some oil and used brute force to unblock stuck parts, gradually bringing the decaying machine back to life. Now it was time for a practical test. Jess started a forklift and lifted a log, placing it on the sawmill. Eustace secured it, and then they started the motor. The saw blade began to spin wildly, appearing to function normally. With palpable tension, they moved the log towards the saw blade, and slowly it passed through, cutting the first board. Eustace couldn't help but roar in excitement. They had succeeded. Without hesitation, Jess decided to buy the machine. Now they needed to relocate the machine. Jess had cleared a space in the woodland near his home for this purpose. They cut down trees and were currently clearing the stumps. Under their diligent work, the site was quickly prepared. Next, they positioned the machine, slowly and steadily backing it into place. Before setting the machine, they laid a solid foundation. Together, they managed to settle the sawmill firmly, but to ensure stability, they continuously adjusted the base to keep it level. Since the sawmill lacked an electric power source, they brought in a tractor to provide the necessary power. They connected the tractor and the machine with a conveyor belt, and this setup worked effectively. The saw blade started spinning wildly again, and the machine resumed normal function. They placed a log on it, and the first board was officially cut, signifying the promising start of Jess's good life ahead. This perfume was made by soaking in fish oil. When applied to animal skin and ignited with a lighter, it immediately produces a burnt smell. This is an effective method to attract pine martens. Here in Montana's Salish Mountains, Paul is a full-time hunter. With the arrival of heavy snow, he is ready to begin his trapping season. Pine marten and mink are his main targets. Although the value of fur has slightly decreased this year, any catch helps subsidize his fuel costs. Before leaving, however, he needs to modify his sled by installing a shield. Due to the thick snow, ice could enter the sled, increasing its weight and fuel consumption. Paul welded a bracket at the front of the sled and attached a plastic sheet to it, creating a snow shield. He then connected the sled to his snowmobile. After simulating the scenario, he felt the shield would be very practical. Now he was ready to depart. The landscape, covered in white snow, was breathtaking. While enjoying the scenery, Paul suddenly stopped because he spotted an excellent trapping location near a drainage pipe. Placing a trap here seemed ideal. He took out some meat for bait and poured fish oil over it, a scent irresistible to mink. After setting up, he moved on. Paul, now 46, had never caught a pine marten before. Pine martens, small mammal-like creatures with very soft fur, are highly prized by the affluent. They typically inhabit high altitudes, so Paul headed towards a mountain peak at 7,000 feet. As he ascended, the terrain became steeper and the snow thicker. Despite the challenges, nothing could stop Paul. He is a hunter, and his only option was to move forward. His determination paid off, and he finally reached his destination. surrounded by towering pine trees with snowflakes continuously falling, creating a mysterious atmosphere. Paul was ready to commence his work. However, his thoughts drifted back to the start of the season, when the old hunter, Tom, taught him a technique for trapping pine marten. He took some tools and walked into the forest, selecting a wooden pole no more than 4 inches in diameter. This precaution was because the area also had many lynxes, which are protected animals, and a thinner pole prevents them from climbing it. Paul angled the pole against a tree and fixed a box on it, placing a trap at the entrance. Inside the box, he had already placed a piece of muskrat meat. Next, he took out a secret sauce made from beaver glands, known for its enticing scent. But there was one more step. Paul poured fish oil on muskrat fur and ignited it with a lighter. The burning scent spread rapidly, designed to lure pine martens even from a distance. Over the next period, Paul was busy setting traps for mink. Although it was hard work, he enjoyed it. During this time, he spotted a moose lying in the snow and warmly greeted it, only to receive an indifferent response. Paul chuckled to ease the awkwardness. Since the hunting season was over, the moose was safe. Paul continued his work, placing a piece of beaver meat in a box and setting it on the snow. This trap was intended for weasels. After setting the trap, he was ready to leave, but the moose was blocking the path. So he started his snowmobile, and the loud noise finally scared the moose into standing up. Just as Paul thought it would leave, the moose stood still, unusually. Indeed, further away was a younger moose. It turned out that the moose was protecting its offspring. Patiently, Paul waited until both moose had completely disappeared before driving home. The next day was even colder, but Paul was up early to check the traps. Soon, he arrived at the first trap, which brought a surprise. A mink was caught in the trap, already frozen solid. Paul was thrilled as the mink provided a perfect start to his day. After resetting the trap, he moved on. Sometime later, he reached the second trap, which, unfortunately, had not caught anything. He continued to the next location, but the third trap was also disappointing. Paul felt a bit down, but understood that this was part of the process of growth. A shift in mindset often brings good luck. Indeed, the next trap had a catch, a stoat. Although it was not as valuable as a pine marten, it was better than nothing, and proved his trapping skills were effective. Catching a pine marten was just a matter of time. In Montana's Tobacco Mountains, a record-breaking blizzard swept through the area. Cougars from the Ruby Valley descended in large numbers, harassing local ranches. Jack, a cougar hunter, was called upon to address this issue. Despite the harsh weather, his task was to drive these predators back up the mountains, with his hunting dogs ready, but held back to conserve their energy. Jack carried the dogs partway up a mountain trail, where he spotted cougar tracks. Analyzing the situation, he felt the tracks were fresh. It was time to release the dogs, trained to pick up scents in the air. Despite the deep snow, the dogs enthusiastically set off. Jack took a roundabout route up the mountain to save some distance. Midway up, he checked his GPS and saw the dogs were still on the right track on the ridge. However, after advancing a bit further, his snowmobile suddenly died. Jack tried to restart it, but the motor was unresponsive. Upon inspection, he found the exhaust very hot, but couldn't identify any specific issues. Just then, his GPS alerted him. Checking it, he saw the dogs had stopped. They had likely cornered a cougar, a piece of good news. Jack sent a text to his wife, Annika, via satellite to come and assist. After climbing for a while, Jack reached the dogs, who had indeed cornered a cougar. The cougar looked pitiful, indicating a successful expulsion. They were now 12 miles from the ranch, and it was time to end the chase. Jack returned with the dogs to where his snowmobile was parked. As night fell, and Annika had not yet appeared, Jack fed the dogs and looked for a suitable place to set up a shelter. They would have to spend the night outdoors. He built a makeshift tent against a tree and crawled in with the dogs, preparing for a sleepless night. Meanwhile, in Idaho's Sawtooth Mountains, a rugged and desolate area, Harry and Kid lived off the land. Today, with the weather clear, they plan to go hunting in the mountains. In the mountains, the white-tailed deer is considered prime game. Tracks of these deer are commonly found in the snow. Although white-tailed deer are abundant in the mountains, local laws strictly regulate hunting to protect ecological balance. Outside of rifle hunting season, hunters are required to use primitive weapons. Kid is using an old-fashioned black powder shotgun, which is cumbersome to load and fires only one shot at a time. Hence, hunting requires a bit of luck since these deer are highly alert, and the old shotgun needs to be close to ensure accuracy. Kid chose to proceed on foot to avoid startling the deer and occasionally used binoculars to scout the area. By chance, he spotted a deer in the distance, but it was too far away. Kid moved towards the target with his gun ready. After some time, he suddenly stopped. 2 deer appeared in the valley below. Kid quickly raised his gun, but the deer, sensing danger, ran swiftly along the ridge, making it impossible for Kid to shoot. He could only watch them disappear and muttered curses under his breath. After calming himself, Kid continued to search for another target. Meanwhile, Harry was also actively searching for deer. The brothers, united in their effort, knew that teamwork could accomplish much. Their persistence paid off when Kid spotted several deer after crossing a ridge, including a well-fed buck. He aimed briefly and fired, but unfortunately missed. The buck looked around, puzzled, not realizing the danger. Kid quickly reloaded, a process that took at least a minute. By the time he finished, the buck was still playing with a few does. Kid did not rush forward, noticing a doe with her tail raised high, signaling alertness. He decided to circle around the side of the hill and attack from a higher position, catching them off guard. This tactic worked, and the buck was taken down with a single shot. However, the downhill path was difficult, and by the time he reached the spot, only a few bloodstains remained. The buck had vanished. He began to search for it, and Harry soon arrived on horseback. The brothers decided to join forces in their search. The deer was injured and unlikely to have gone far, but the dense bushes could make it hard to find. With only 2 hours left until dark, they would lose any chance of finding the animal once night fell. The urgency grew, and they split up to search. It was Harry who had the better luck. While wandering, he unexpectedly spotted the deer in the bushes. He called his brother over. The deer had already stopped breathing. Kid hurried over and could finally relax. He asked Harry to fetch the horses while he stayed to gut the buck. He was grateful to the deer, which would help them through the cold winter. Meanwhile, in Montana's Tobacco Mountains, Jack crawled out of his sleeping bag. The previous night had been bitterly cold, disrupting his sleep. As he packed up, his thoughts drifted back to the previous day. They had driven off a cougar, but his snowmobile had broken down, forcing him to stay on the mountain. When he returned to the snowmobile, his wife had just arrived. She had received his distress signal but couldn't travel at night due to the danger, waiting until daylight to come. Relieved to find her husband alive, she also brought some dog food to feed the hunting dogs. While the dogs ate, the couple connected the snowmobiles. Once ready, they set off for home. Jack drove, occasionally looking back to ensure there were no issues. However, he suddenly stopped because he saw fresh cougar tracks in the snow, causing his heart to skip a beat. Was it the cougar from yesterday? He examined the tracks and realized they were from a different cougar, but they were less than an hour old and near the ranch. Jack had promised the ranch owner to protect the property, so he had to cancel his plans to return home and instead drive the cougar back up the mountain. The hunting dogs quickly picked up the scent and dashed towards the target, with Jack and Annika following close behind for a romantic chase in the snowy mountains. Walking in the snowy mountains was not easy. They climbed up and down, constantly checking their GPS to ensure they were on the right path. With the steep slopes, their physical exertion increased significantly, and Annika was beginning to struggle to keep up. Fortunately, they could hear the hunting dogs barking nearby. Encouraged, the two continued to climb, but the mountain path was rougher than expected. It seemed the cougar had chosen steep paths to evade the dogs, making the climb difficult for Jack and Annika. Yet, a bigger challenge lay ahead. Jack's face fell as they approached a bare rock wall, which posed a serious danger. With apprehension, Jack quickly crossed the area. This terrain was trivial for the cougar, but perilous for the dogs, which could easily fall off the cliff. Ignoring his fatigue, Jack rushed to reach the dogs. Upon catching up, he called to the dogs to come down quickly and counted them to ensure all were present. Jack surmised the cougar had jumped across from the ridge to the opposite side, something the dogs couldn't do, which explained why they were lingering there. With the mission to drive off the cougar complete, it was time to head home. However, the battle between humans and cougars would not end here. They might return. In Montana's Salish Mountains, the recent surge in wolf populations has severely disrupted ecological balance. In the food-scarce winter, wolves descend from the mountains to harass ranches, causing unbearable losses for ranch owners. Today, Paul was invited to a ranch recently visited by a wolf pack. Amidst his fear, the ranch owner offered a substantial bounty of $750 for each wolf killed. Paul gladly accepted the task as he could earn an additional $500 by selling the wolf pelts to fur traders. However, Paul's thoughts were interrupted by wolf tracks in the snow. He counted 4 wolves, and the tracks were several days old. Wolves have a large range, covering up to 200 square miles, and constantly move. According to patterns, they might revisit the area in about a week, giving Paul plenty of time to prepare. He arrived at a camp at the base of the mountain, a ranch outpost used in summer by workers tending to hundreds of cattle, but currently empty. Paul planned to spend 2 weeks here, racing against time to set up traps. His first task was to look for signs of wolf activity. After a while, he was stopped by a carcass on the roadside. Paul approached and saw it looked like a David's deer, devoured almost entirely by wild animals. Judging by the marks, the culprits were likely wolves. Statistics show that a wolf can consume up to 20 deer per year, whereas a deer only gives birth to 1 fawn annually. In contrast, the leading female wolf can produce 5 to 6 pups in the same period. This breeding rate mismatch means that human intervention is necessary to control wolf populations. Paul decided to set traps in the area because wolves have a keen sense of smell, so he wore gloves to prevent human scent from contaminating the traps. Wolves are also cunning and intelligent, so to avoid detection, Paul hid the wires among the branches. As a wolf passes through, it would get caught by the neck. The more it struggles, the tighter the snare becomes. After setting it up, Paul was very pleased with the trap. He then moved on to find another location. Soon, Paul arrived at the other side of the ranch near the woods, often the main direction from which wolves attack. Although there are no cattle in the ranch now, allowing wolves to settle here would make it much harder to drive them away when the cattle return in the spring. Paul's strategy was to create a perimeter of traps around this area to signal to the wolves that this was a no-entry zone. He started to dig frantically with a pickaxe, preparing to create a pitfall. This trapping method simulates the illusion that another predator has hidden food here. He then took out a large animal trap, placed it at the entrance, and covered it with filter paper, lightly sprinkling some sand over it. To alleviate any suspicions, he mixed 2 different types of soil to make it look natural. Next, Paul pulled out a bottle of sauce made from beaver glands, which emits a scent ideal for luring predators. He also took out a bottle of fox urine and poured it near the entrance, creating the illusion that a fox had captured a beaver and dragged it into the hole. The idea that a wolf could steal another animal's food is an exciting prospect for them, and they would be quickly attracted to the sight. Paul was very hopeful about this trap. Returning to camp, he began preparing for the night, which promised to be very cold. He chopped plenty of wood in anticipation of needing to keep warm. As dusk fell, it was the time when wolves are most active. Paul mimicked a wolf howl, which sounded remarkably realistic. Soon, real wolf howls echoed from the mountains, confirming their presence nearby. The strategic game between Paul and the wolves had officially begun. Unbeknownst to him, 2 weeks had passed. During this time, it ended in a stalemate with both sides. Meanwhile, new snowfall arrived. Paul's initial enthusiasm had faded. His traps were again compromised. The wolves had sprung from them at the moment of contact, dodging the traps and leaving behind only a few hairs as if mocking him. This hurt Paul's pride, and his clever plan to outsmart the wolves had failed. In 2 weeks, he had caught only 1 wolf, too short of his target. With his return home scheduled for tomorrow, he reluctantly began to retrieve his traps. He soon reached the second trap, but it too was disappointing. After collecting it, he moved on, not expecting much from the next trap. However, it held a surprise: a caught coyote. While not as dangerous as wolves, coyotes posed a greater threat to the ranch as they often prey on calves and could also fetch a bounty. Paul's mood improved slightly, but he found the coyote frozen. Careful not to damage the fur, he gently chipped away the ice and snow with a pickaxe and lifted it gently. With the coyote now clear of ice, he decided to handle it further once back home. Now pressed for time, Paul continued to collect the remaining traps. The cunning of the wolves had profoundly changed his perspective. His once hopeful traps had failed one after another. With little expectation left for the remaining traps, he just wanted to collect them. Yet, surprises often come when least expected. Paul's excitement surged as he found a wolf caught in a snare. Its large size was incomparable to that of the coyote. The wolf exuded a regal and commanding presence, its noble demeanor striking even in defeat. Paul couldn't help but admire the wolf. Despite being adversaries, his respect for the animal was unaffected. He recognized many admirable qualities in the wolf. As Paul reflected, he collected the trap. The remaining traps brought no further catches, but Paul was already satisfied. The 3 animals would bring in nearly $4,000 in income and also reduce the ranch's risks. The calving season was approaching, and this small victory promised prosperity for the entire ranch. Today was Paul's lucky day. On his way back, he stumbled upon a deer antler, a gift left by a moose, perhaps acknowledging his efforts in eliminating the wolves. It seemed as if the moose had deliberately placed this token of gratitude on his path. Paul joyfully accepted the gift and happily set off on his journey home. This is a massive beaver weighing at least 50 kilograms, akin to the Shaquille O'Neal of beavers. It's the largest Tom has ever caught in his career, exciting him greatly. Here in Montana's Bison Valley, Tom and Nancy rely on each other. After a kiss goodbye to his wife, Tom heads out to work. This year's fur trade is booming. Although his apprentice Sean continuously provides game, the active Tom can't sit still. He checks the trap lines near his home daily, a routine since moving here in 1977. In a few weeks, Tom will turn 80. Age may wear on the body, but not his spirit. As long as he breathes, he won't stop enjoying life. Soon he arrives at a pond surrounded by numerous willows and poplars, the beaver's food source, leading to their rapid reproduction. Most of Tom's beavers come from here. The pond is large, but beaver activity is easy to spot by the dams they build. Tom's traps are set near these dams. At the first trap, he finds it empty and moves on. At the next spot, Tom chuckles as he sees a beaver caught in the trap. Catching a beaver always brings joy, even to an octogenarian. This beaver is unusually fat, likely the family leader. Tom resets the trap, hoping for continued luck. He adds a homemade sauce made from beaver glands to attract more, emitting a scent unfamiliar to the beaver family. With leadership likely contested among them, the appearance of a stranger's scent will surely draw them to investigate. Tom laboriously lifts the beaver onto his sled and continues his rounds. Besides beaver traps, he has set others, like the ground box traps for weasels, common in the valley during winter. Unfortunately, these are empty today. He set up 10 traps and caught only 1 prey, but Tom was satisfied. Not every day brings a catch, and many hunters return empty-handed. Tom enjoys the process, not the quantity of game. With no mortgage stress, he loaded the beaver into his truck and headed home happily. In his workshop, he quickly placed the beaver on the workbench to skin it before the organs decayed, avoiding bacterial damage to the fur. Before starting, he warmed up the room. An adult beaver typically sells for about $300, but this large one could fetch nearly double. From its tail alone, Tom could make 2 sheaths. Beaver skin is close to fat, making cutting tricky even for an experienced hunter like Tom. Taking no chances, he carefully skinned the beaver, then applied a bag of salt to the skin to kill bacteria and dry it out. After a busy day, Tom was hungry and ready for dinner. Thousands of miles away in South Carolina, it's spring. Near the ocean, dense maritime forests line the shore. Eustace, far from home, is vacationing at his old friend Jess's place. Today, Jess got a part-time job to repair a dock and brought experienced Eustace along. They arrived at a dock used by shrimp boats, but it was tilting due to age and seawater erosion. Craig, the dock manager, was troubled. After hearing Craig's story, they inspected the dock and found the situation grim. Fortunately, they had a secret weapon capable of completing the task, a sawmill they had recently acquired. After parting with Craig, the two headed into the forest to select the right timber and planned the direction for the tree to fall. Once sure, Eustace started the chainsaw and cut halfway through a small tree next to it. Jess then used a forklift to push the tree down, a method both efficient and safe. With their teamwork, they brought down the large tree, which Eustace then split in the middle. Jess hauled the logs to the sawmill, secured them, and started the machine to trim the edges, keeping only the solid core for beams. Each log yielded 2 thick planks. They flipped the logs to continue cutting the other half. Soon, they had gathered enough materials and were ready to head to the dock. Eustace planned to reinforce the sinking dock by first lifting it. Using a winch, they raised the collapsed section by 8 inches to level it. They drilled holes at the junctions of the posts and beams and inserted a corrosion-resistant stainless steel bar, securing it with bolts and chains to keep the original beams and posts tightly connected. However, this was not enough to support the deck. They then used the heavy planks they prepared, again using the winch to place them slightly below the deck at a vertical angle to the posts, drilling holes and securing them with stainless steel to fix the beams between two posts, strengthening the dock's structure. Eustace was pleased to see his friend complete the repair, indicating his sawmill could be profitable. Meanwhile, a beautiful rabbit had fallen into a hunter's trap and was about to become a tasty dinner. Life here is simple, reliant on nature for food. This is in northern Canada, near Illiguk Lake, a remote location. Alan and Jenny live by the lake, where a 2-day blizzard had caused significant damage to the forest. With the weather clearing, Alan set out to check the only road into town, ensuring it was clear for any emergencies. The road stretched 20 miles across the lake to a logging road leading to town. Due to lack of use, it was covered in snow. Alan had a bad feeling, and soon enough, his snowmobile was stuck in a snow pit. He tried to free it by rocking it back and forth, but the heavy vehicle just swayed in place. With no other option, he turned off the engine and started shoveling snow from under the skis. After every heavy snowfall, he performs these tasks, but today's difficulties came early. He hadn't even gone a mile before he had to clear the snow. Afterward, he pulled out a cable and tied it to a nearby tree. Then, he restarted the engine and slowly pulled the snowmobile out of the pit using the winch. He continued onward. Meanwhile, his wife had her own tasks. She went hunting nearby to gather some fresh meat, knowing her husband would expend a lot of energy today. A tender, delicious rabbit was her first choice. Soon, she found a rabbit trail. Rabbits have many predators, needing to avoid owls from above and lynxes and foxes from the ground, so they are usually active in areas with dense brush. This is where she set her traps. The noose trap she used was simple and effective. Once it ensnared the rabbit's head, the more it struggled, the tighter the bind became. Jenny tied the wire to a small tree, setting the trap about 8 centimeters above the ground, directly above the rabbit trail. To better guide the rabbit, Jenny collected some branches and planted them on the ground to create a path. She then hung a pink ribbon on a tree to mark the location of the trap. Now she had to set up other traps. On the other side, Alan had advanced 7 miles with 13 more to go. In addition to the heavy snow, other obstacles included fallen trees blocking the path. Alan sighed, took out his chainsaw, and began to cut the large tree. The tree was heavy, and he had to cut it into several pieces to move it easily. After clearing the obstacle, he continued his journey. Meanwhile, Jenny was still setting traps when she spotted a ribbon from a trap she had set the day before. She went to check it, and was surprised to find a snowshoe hare caught in the trap, frozen solid. As daylight faded, Alan was nearing the end of clearing the path. He was just a mile away from reaching the logging road when he encountered his final difficulty. A complex tangle of more than a dozen trees blocking the road completely. Alan felt a deep sense of helplessness, but had no choice but to persevere. After some time, he finally cleared the path, exhausted but relieved as he faced no further incidents and successfully reached the logging road. The road to town was open again, and he could now head home. However, there's never a dull moment in a mountain man's life. A new day means new tasks. Today, the couple planned to add materials to their roof. 7 years ago, they bought this abandoned homestead with 12 cabins needing renovation. So far, they've only completed 3. Ideally, such work should be done in summer, but summer is their busiest season as anglers from across the country come to fish at the lake. They provide services to earn money, so roof repairs must wait until winter. Alan started the sawmill to collect some planks for the roof rafters, using logs from their yard that were cut down due to safety concerns. Now, they could be repurposed. First, they needed to dismantle the old roof. Alan took a forceful approach, wildly cutting with a chainsaw. But this backfired when the roof collapsed, causing Jenny to scream in fright. Fortunately, Alan was only scraped, but the scare was enough to shake him. On the other side of the roof, he chose to cut from the top. However, 3 years ago, he fell from the greenhouse roof and broke 6 bones, leaving him with some psychological scars. He proceeded cautiously, slowly dismantling the eaves. Now ready for the next step, he placed the wooden planks on the roof, measured their size, and trimmed them to fit. Before installing the planks, he needed to add a crossbeam. Working in perfect harmony, the two laid the heavy beam across the roof and secured it by angling two rafters on top, ensuring the beam would not fall. After a busy period, they constructed a grid-like wooden frame using the planks. The next step was to install tin sheets, which are lightweight and offer good waterproofing while also absorbing some sunlight to keep the interior warm. Alan nailed them one by one to the frame. When it was time to secure the last sheet, Jenny tied a rope around a piece of wood and threw the other end to Alan, allowing him to hold onto the rope and prevent slipping off the roof. Under his wife's anxious gaze, Alan successfully drove in the last screws. He could now come down, but the work wasn't finished. He still had to install a critical component, the ridge cap, which provides waterproofing. Unexpectedly, the calm day turned windy. Alan felt shaky on the roof, causing Jenny distress as she feared an accident might occur. Fortunately, Alan was careful and successfully installed the ridge cap, safely descending afterward. The couple embraced, reflecting on the hardships of life, then slowly walked back to the house under the sunset. Life is tough, but they love their work and enjoy the happiness that a free life brings. Men's happiness is simple. They tirelessly build a small boat just to fish in the river. This is in Idaho's Sawtooth Mountains, where Harry and Kid run a ranch. Today, Kid mysteriously brought out a magazine featuring his wife's great-grandparents, who were nobles and formed a small fleet to conquer the wilderness. The river that crosses the Sawtooth Mountains, named the Salmon River, is popular for winter salmon spawning. They wanted to go fishing, and the magazine detailed the boat's specifications. As a skilled boat builder, Kid was fully capable of replicating such a boat. The two set to work immediately, marking dimensions on the boards before cutting them. Next, they needed to glue two plywood sheets together using high-quality epoxy resin applied along the edges of both. They pressed the boards tightly together, covered them with wax paper, and placed heavy objects on top to ensure a strong bond. Once the resin dried, the boards were perfectly joined. Then, they started making ribs for the boat. Due to the boat's unique shape, each rib needed to be cut to specific lengths and angles. After ensuring the measurements were correct, Kid first used silicone adhesive, then secured the ribs with screws. By this time, the plywood's bonding was nearly complete. They checked the results and were remarkably pleased. Next, they drew a straight line down the middle of the board and cut along it, preparing to use it as the side of the boat's hull. They aligned the two ends and used a piece of wood to hold them together before installing the ribs. The shape of the boat's hull began to take form. As they progressed, they installed other components. As time passed, the construction of the drift boat neared completion. They trimmed off any excess wood and smoothed the rough edges. Then, they moved on to the next step. To prevent falling out during a struggle with a fish, they added a support point to the boat. Afterward, they flipped the boat over to waterproof the bottom. They used epoxy resin again, this time mixing in some graphite powder to make the bottom black and more slick. Soon, they had applied a shiny coat to the boat's bottom and waited for it to dry naturally. A few hours later, they returned to the workshop. The boat's bottom was dry. They flipped the boat back over, added seats, and brought two wooden paddles, inserting them into the corresponding metal rings. At this moment, the drift boat was finally completed. They dragged the boat to the riverbank, ready to test its performance. Sitting in the boat, they found it easy to maneuver and were ready to go fishing. The next day, they prepared various supplies and chose to go downstream, embarking on an exciting and adventurous journey. A doe on the bank curiously watched them, unafraid and intrigued by their presence. After passing a smooth section of the river, the boat entered rapid waters. They put on life jackets, ready for a real challenge. But the rapids were more turbulent than expected, causing the boat to shake wildly and risk capsizing while the spray hit their faces with a chilling thrill. Excited, they shouted with joy, forgetting all their troubles. Once they navigated through the dangerous stretch, the river calmed again, and their spirits settled slightly. Unsure of the salmon migration progress, they decided to manually check. Harry took out his fishing rod and began to try fishing. Unfortunately, after drifting for a while without any fish biting, they encountered another set of rapids that seemed perilous. They docked the boat at the shore to observe first. Kid assessed the route in his mind. While risky, it was still within his control. They set off again, and it was now Kid's turn to showcase his skills. First, he turned the boat sideways to slow it down. As they entered the rapids, he promptly straightened the boat, Around the bends, he adjusted its direction again. With over a decade of boating experience, Kidd expertly navigated the small boat, as if it were a leaf floating with the current, yet perfectly controlling its direction to avoid collisions with rocks. Under his skilled handling, the boat seemed to come alive, always dodging dangers at unbelievable angles. His professional performance earned praise from his brother, and even left a small bird astounded. After drifting safely for a while, they encountered another challenge. A mountain on the riverbank cast a long shadow, causing the river to freeze in that area. They chose to go ashore and drag the boat forward, step by step. Once past this section, they reboarded and continued drifting downstream. Fortunately, the rest of the journey went smoothly. Harry took out his fishing rod again, waiting for a bite. Besides salmon, the river also housed native rainbow trout, known as the ghosts of the river due to their elusiveness. However, this time they were prepared with tasty bait favored by big fish, which, combined with their professional rods, promised immediate results. Indeed, they soon had a fish on the line. Harry quickly reeled in while Kidd used a net to catch what turned out to be their first salmon of the day. It hadn't spawned yet. Post-spawning fish, known as zombie fish, are inedible. It seemed the salmon run had reached their spot. Suddenly, both rods reacted at the same time. Each caught a fish, and it was just the beginning. One after another, fish were hooked. Knowing the principle of not overfishing, they planned to catch only 10 fish in total. Once satisfied, they would head home. Meanwhile, in Montana's Salish Mountains, a hunter's paradise with abundant wildlife, Paul was busy with his traps, taking advantage of spring's approach and the melting ice. It was an excellent time to trap otters, which follow the water currents to find mates. However, a deadly trap awaited them. Back home, Paul started processing his recent catch, which included a wolf. Wolves are cunning and difficult to trap, but their pelts are valuable, easily selling for $500. The wolf he caught would fetch an even higher price because a customer wanted a taxidermy specimen. This required meticulous skinning without errors, justifying a higher price. Although this was a tedious and dull task, Paul was deep in thought while working. So far, his efforts were substantial enough to change his life, as he had nearly saved enough for a down payment to buy a homestead. It didn't take long for him to skin the wolf pelt. After a careful inspection to ensure there were no flaws, he was ready to dry it. He placed the wolf pelt in a rotating machine to buff it using processed corn cobs, which function like a comb to remove impurities from the fur. This season, Paul also caught 16 coyotes. The value of coyote fur is somewhat lower, totaling about $1,200 for the lot. Additionally, he trapped many beavers, tallying 9 high-quality pelts. Next, he took out a pile of fur. These were muskrat pelts, and he had caught 65 muskrats this season. Although their value isn't high, sometimes quantity is key. He also had 6 mink pelts and a few otter and badger furs. Due to their scarcity, these furs were in demand. Paul summed up his 3-month haul, which surprisingly could bring in around $20,000. Now, he needed to pack up these furs and send them to the tannery to be converted into real cash. The next day, with money in his pocket, Paul took his son to fulfill a lifelong dream. Up a small path into the mountains, there was a vacant plot where he had bought land. He shared his plans with his son. Once the snow and ice melted, they could start building. Both were very excited about this prospect. This was why Paul worked so hard. Thinking about passing assets onto future generations filled him with overwhelming emotion. In the north, at Lake Iliamna, it would be a few more weeks before the ice melted. Jenny was collecting water through a hole in the ice. Lacking a water system, they had to rely on raw lake water. She carried 2 buckets of water to the greenhouse, preparing to cultivate some vegetables. Meanwhile, Alan was preparing to repair a water supply system. He wanted to channel lake water into the greenhouse to ease his wife's burden. Although unfamiliar with water systems, fortunately, there was existing equipment on the homestead, albeit 7 years old. First, Alan needed to reinforce the wooden frame. Next, he checked the pipes stretching to the lake, looking for any damage. Indeed, he found a section of the pipe had broken, likely due to a snowmobile passing over. Alan gathered some tools to flatten the broken edges and fit a coupling. While he was busy with the repair, his wife Jenny was preparing the soil in the greenhouse. The area, being volcanic, had soil unsuitable for vegetable cultivation outside. However, the greenhouse soil, which they mixed themselves, contained minerals like calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus, enriched with chicken manure. They had also purchased peat moss to help retain moisture and added crushed eggshells for extra calcium. Jenny, who loves tomatoes, decided to plant them first. She started the stove to provide continuous heat to the greenhouse. Meanwhile, Alan finished fixing the pipe and was ready to test the pump. He took a water pump capable of pushing water 25 meters to the lakeside. Before pumping, he added some hot water to the pipe to ensure it wasn't frozen. After feeling confident, he started the pump, but after a while, it failed to draw water, indicating the pipe might still be frozen below. On the other hand, Jenny thought of using wood ash, an excellent material for enriching soil nutrients. Eager for delicious tomatoes, she had also added other residues like partridge and rabbit bones, which had been thrown into the fire pit throughout the winter. She believed these ashes would provide rich nutrients. At the greenhouse door, Jenny remembered another type of fertilizer she had collected that looked like chocolate beans, moose droppings. She added these to the soil for a secondary upgrade. Now everything was ready except for the fresh water, which depended on her husband's efforts. Alan started the chainsaw and cut into the ice. He removed the ice blocks, allowing lake water to fill the gap. He then inserted the water pipe and started the water pump. This time, water flowed clearly. Alan connected the pipes and followed the flow to check for leaks. Reaching the wooden frame, he saw the water tank was full and water was starting to overflow. Now, he could channel the water into the greenhouse. Alan connected the water pipe to an outlet and turned on the switch. Jenny waited a moment, and finally, water came out. They were thrilled, feeling one step closer to a happier life. They embraced, encouraging each other, then went home to enjoy dinner. The process of making fish oil was visually pleasing. First, the fish meat was cut off, and the skin was thrown into a pot. Some water was added, and it was simmered on low heat for several hours to produce a yellow liquid, precious fish oil. This is in the northern Washington Kettle Range. Ray Livingston, a full-time hunter, was excited about spring's arrival, bringing life and rapidly rising river levels, prime fishing time. Each spring, he fished for whitefish in the lake, a vital food source, and made fish oil from them. The oil was primarily used to make a hunting lure spray, crucial for attracting game. Whitefish, a large freshwater species, can weigh up to 20 kilograms. Ray aimed to catch about 10 of these fish. Soon, he reached his destination and opened his tackle box, filled with various fishing parts. Because whitefish are predatory, his bait was a small fish-like model with a hook on its back. Ray then hung a small insect on the hook, completing the lure. Now, he could start fishing. Ray moved the rod up and down, giving the lure a swimming motion. The method was effective, and soon, a fish bit. Ray quickly reeled in, but the fish put up a strong fight. After a tug of war, Ray emerged victorious, pulling a freshwater cod to the surface. Although it wasn't a whitefish, Ray still smiled triumphantly, holding his catch. This was just the beginning for him. He wanted to strike while the iron was hot. Today, the lake was calm with a few wild ducks swimming by, a sign of good things to come. Sure enough, after a while, another fish bit the bait. The fishing rod bent into an exaggerated angle as Ray rhythmically pulled the line, gradually bringing the fish aboard. It was a whitefish, Ray's first target of the day, and this catch seemed to open the door to his luck. Soon, a second fish struck, and Ray seized the opportunity, growing more vigorous with each catch. He was so delighted that he couldn't resist giving the fish a kiss. At this rate, he would quickly complete his task. As thunder rolled, sudden spring rain began to fall. Fortunately, Ray had already met his goal and returned home just in time. But there was no time to rest. He needed to extract the fish oil while the fish were fresh. He started by cutting near the fish gills, chopping in, then slicing horizontally to split the fish in two. He cut the meat off the skin to enjoy as sashimi, and the rest went into the pot. Following the same process, he kept the meat and put all the skins in the pot, adding just enough water to cover them. He then placed the pot on the stove to simmer on low heat for a few hours. Meanwhile, he processed some meat from 3 beavers he had recently caught. Due to the parasites typically found in beaver meat, it was not used for eating, but worked well as bait. Ground into mince, a little smeared on traps during the trapping season proved highly effective. As time passed, jars of beaver conserve kept appearing, preparing for the upcoming trapping season. By the time he finished the last jar, it was about time to check the pot. As he lifted the lid, a fragrant aroma filled the air. Looking inside, he saw a layer of fish oil floating on the surface, indicating a successful extraction. Ray scooped the liquid into a bottle and used a sieve to filter out impurities. Soon, he filled a bottle. Since water and fish oil have different densities, they separated quickly. Ray then used a spoon to transfer the top layer of fish oil into another container, obtaining brightly colored pure fish oil. His hard work today was very satisfying, and not in vain. In Montana's Ruby Valley, with the arrival of spring, newborn calves started to be born, marking a vulnerable time for the herd. Today, Jack received a call from a rancher who had spotted a cougar near his property and needed Jack's urgent assistance. As Jack was nearing the ranch, he noticed cougar tracks in the snow beside the road. The prints seemed fresh, likely belonging to the cougar in question. However, since this was a main road with heavy traffic, he took precautions to prevent any accidents by releasing only one experienced hunting dog, Marin, to track the cougar's scent. Marin, the team's most reliable and a lead dog, would set the direction for the others to follow. Jack was concerned, though, as encountering a cougar alone could be dangerous for a hunting dog. After some thought, he released another dog to accompany Marin for mutual support. Urged on by Jack, the dogs energetically bounded up the hill. Soon, they began to run wildly, indicating they had locked onto the target. Jack hurriedly drove to support them, monitoring the GPS as he observed heavy traffic on the highway. This could pose a significant risk if the cougar crossed there. Fortunately, Jack's worries did not materialize. Marin headed towards the countryside. Jack then decided to release the rest of the hunting dogs to assist. Soon, he heard Marin's bark in the distance, signaling the others who rushed to join. Jack smiled in relief. Marin proved to be a capable leader. With a lighter heart, Jack followed slowly behind, finding some fur along the way and an animal carcass under a nearby tree. Two of the dogs were eating from it, which Jack stopped to keep them focused on the hunt. The carcass, a pronghorn, bore the hallmarks of a cougar's kill, explaining the cougar's frequent appearances since it hadn't finished its meal. After examining the site, Jack continued uphill and soon could hear the dogs barking. They had cornered the cougar. Quickening his pace, Jack arrived to see the cougar trembling in a tree, with the dogs eagerly circling below. He immediately calmed the dog that was trying to climb, urging it to ease its excitement. This was a very young female cougar whose hunting skills needed improvement, which is why she had wandered into the valley where prey was easier to catch. However, after today's encounter with the hunting dogs, she likely wouldn't dare come down from the mountains again. Terrified, she just wanted to go home to her mother. Taking advantage of the hunting dog's distraction, she suddenly leapt from the tree and escaped the encirclement. The dogs chased urgently behind her, with Jack running after them. After some time, Jack found the dog team again, and the cougar was once more treed. As dusk fell, Jack decided it was time to end the chase and called the dogs home. Despite the brief encounter, it left a lasting impression on the young lioness. Hunter Paul had a perfect season, earning nearly $20,000 over 3 months. After 6 years of planning, he finally gathered enough for a down payment and bought 10 acres of land in the mountains. With spring finally here and today being a sunny day, Paul was ready to officially move. Since building a new house would take months, he decided to move his old house to use as a temporary residence. For this, he borrowed a trailer and worked with his son, Guise. First, they secured the cabin firmly to the trailer. To prevent it from moving, they took protective measures. Once ready, they set off for their destination, 55 miles away. Though not far, the mountain roads were challenging. They became narrow and were lined with trees that could pose obstacles. Paul was very cautious, constantly watching the road ahead, while Guise provided support from behind. They moved slowly and rhythmically. Soon they encountered their first obstacle, a tree that had grown crooked and could scrape the cabin. Paul stopped the vehicle and started his chainsaw, cutting down the tree to clear the path. After clearing the road, they continued on their journey. As time passed, the mountain road became narrower and muddier, severely hindering their progress. To make matters worse, it suddenly started raining. Paul was in a sour mood and cautioned his son to be careful. After a while, they encountered a second obstacle, a rock slide that could potentially puncture their tires. Unwilling to take risks, Paul and his son cleared the debris before continuing. Gies kept an eye on the tires, and just as they seemed to be getting through safely, a large rock nearly touched the tire, as if about to kiss it. Paul inspected the situation and found it wasn't promising. If they proceeded blindly, they would likely hit the rock. He used a hammer to chip off the edges of the rock, then cautiously moved forward. This careful maneuvering eventually allowed them to pass safely. They continued on, and the rest of the journey went smoothly until they reached their destination. However, this did not mean Paul could relax, as the most challenging part was yet to come. They had to unload the cabin without any damage. Fortunately, a friend named Brendan, a longtime buddy of Paul's, came to help. They planned to first prepare the foundation. Brendan chopped down trees, and Gies used a bulldozer to level the ground. They worked energetically and quickly readied the site. Now it was time to unload the cabin. Paul slowly reversed, positioning the trailer correctly. They then unfastened the chains and reattached them to the bulldozer. With its help, they carefully lowered the cabin. This process had to be handled with utmost caution. Despite their efforts, there was a significant wobble, which frightened Gies into stopping immediately. Once the cabin stabilized, he continued. And this time, there were no more incidents. The cabin landed safely, and now it was just a matter of driving the trailer out. Paul started the vehicle and slowly pulled the trailer away. At this moment, he felt a tremendous sense of relief and belonging. This place would now serve as his homestead, and a new chapter in his life was beginning. He looked forward to it eagerly. In Idaho's Sawtooth Mountains, the Harry brothers had finally survived the cold winter. It was time to start work on the ranch. They planned to build a cellar at the edge of the ranch to store some farm products. Since purchasing their first herd of cattle 4 years ago, their business had been thriving. Now, they were reaping the rewards. This year, they bought 5 acres of land for vegetable cultivation. The cellar was already dug out, and the next step was to lay the foundation. The 2 men trimmed the edges of the logs and then used a cart to transport them into the cellar. These logs, sourced from their grandfather's sawmill, had many years of history and showed signs of weathering, but they were still quite heavy, requiring both men to push them together. Next, they secured the logs with 2 planks, placing a support post on each side. They then placed a thick log horizontally across the 2 posts and secured it with long screws. Using the same method, they continued to reinforce the structure. After some busy time, the framework gradually took shape. The next step was to install the wooden planks. The 2 men fixed the planks side by side, and through mechanical operations, 3 walls quietly formed. They then brought in more wood, placing it piece by piece on top of the frame to serve as the roof. Once the roofing was complete, they covered it with tarp to provide rain protection. Now that the cellar's foundation was established, the next step was to bury it. To better secure it, they used 2 large stones to prop up the frame before preparing to cover it with soil. This task required Harry to drive above the site, which involved some risk. He drove carefully, unable to see clearly below. But fortunately, Kid constantly observed and directed him from below. With their perfect coordination, the cellar was systematically buried. At one point, Kid asked Harry to stop so he could go inside to check the walls, which seemed to be inclining inward. It appeared that the walls could not withstand the pressure of the soil. They decided to reinforce the structure by cutting planks and fixing them diagonally against the walls for additional support. After completing the reinforcements, they continued and soon filled in the soil. The next step was to design a door. They enlarged the door frame and moved in a pre-made door, first cutting it to the right size and then adding hinges. Although the cellar's appearance was not very appealing, its functionality was fully intact. Now only a few finishing touches were needed. They used a horseshoe as a door lock, which, although unsightly, did not affect its functionality. Then, they designed several wooden shelves inside. With this, the construction of the cellar was finally complete, giving them a profound sense of satisfaction. Once the weather warmed up further, they would start planting vegetables. Old Tom was celebrating his 80th birthday, but he was still busy working. With the arrival of spring, the trading post was about to open. He and his partner Will were making final preparations, including creating a Native American-style teepee as this year's highlight product for the trading season. First, they tied 3 wooden poles together, pulled them up with ropes, and set up a tripod. Meanwhile, at home, Nancy had her own plans. She wanted to bake a cake for a birthday party that evening, a surprise Tom was unaware of. He simply thought he was having dinner with his brother's family, as was typical for his birthdays. But this year, being his 80th, Nancy felt it should be more special. Back to Tom and Will, they installed the last pole, completing the teepee's frame. They secured the frame further with ropes and then draped it with a canvas that was waterproof and insulated. Native Americans have used such teepees for thousands of years, as they are portable and ideal for crossing the Great Plains. The canvas, traditionally made from buffalo hide, required 12 to 14 hides. Nowadays, with buffalo numbers dwindling, such canvas is expensive and hard to find. Due to the canvas's weight, they first tied it to a pole. Then the two men leaned the pole against the frame and wrapped the canvas around it. A few miles away, at his brother Jack's homestead, a surprise for Tom was being prepared. Jack had a dried elk hide from a few weeks ago and planned to turn it into a fur coat. He sketched a design known as a war bonnet on paper, made a scale model with cardboard, and then traced it onto the elk hide. He made a paint from water, hide glue, and soil, which he ground into a fine powder from clay and minerals for a good pigment. After painting, it was Connie's turn to add the finishing touches. She sewed handmade decorations onto the coat, enhancing its aesthetic value. Meanwhile, Tom's teepee was completed. Inside, they lit a campfire and brewed a pot of coffee, a simple reward for their hard work. During their wait, Tom and Will started chatting. Will asked Tom how he planned to spend the rest of his day. Tom replied somewhat plainly that he was just going out for a simple dinner. As one ages, birthdays become less exciting, just like the coffee in his hand. Warm, but with a hint of bitterness, always tasting the same no matter how long you drink it. Birthdays felt the same after experiencing so many. The sentiment remained constant. Reflecting on his life, Tom felt a deep connection with the teepee, having spent many days in such tents. Sitting in the teepee today, he felt quite nostalgic. Meanwhile, at home, the kitchen alarm went off, signaling that the bread was done baking. Next, Nancy prepared to make delicious buttercream frosting. After mixing, she tasted it and found it quite good. She then spread a thick layer of butter on the bread. In a secluded corner of Montana, in the Gallatin Valley, only a few freedom-loving individuals settled. But today, they gathered together at the only tavern in town to celebrate Tom's birthday. Unaware of the plans, Tom was on his way there, and his friends and family eagerly anticipated his reaction. When he finally arrived, everyone held their breath as Tom opened the tavern door. Cheers erupted inside. Surprised and moved, Tom's eyes quickly filled with tears. It was a scene he hadn't expected, thinking it would be just another mundane birthday. He was touched that everyone remembered and had prepared such a surprise for him. Tom hugged each of his friends, thanking them for coming. When he saw the elk robe Jack had prepared, he was overjoyed, loving the gift immensely. It was an unforgettable 80th birthday. He thanked his friends again, and the candle-blowing moment brought the celebration to a peak. Tom would never forget this day. This was his happy life.